There we are. Hey, Tim.
Hey Matt, how you going?
Should I say my hallucinated model of Tim? Good to see you.
You can say that. I won't be offended. Don't worry. I'm hallucinating a new mustache onto you this morning, so
Yeah,
I'm very
that's the.
sure.
Do you know who Jeremy Johnson is? Um,
Not sure. It's a familiar
like
name.
integral philosopher, writes on John Gebser, and
Oh yeah, I think I have his book actually. Yeah, Seeing
yeah,
Through the World. Seeing Through the World.
someone
Is that?
just
Yeah.
seeing through the world. That's it. Yeah, someone just made a comment. He recently shaved his mustache, and I'm trying to grow one, and this person thought Um, he looks strange without his mustache, and I look strange with the mustache, and he's hoping we'll switch back, but I'm gonna go with it for now.
It is a clash with priors, with expectations that people have. We have to update our models of one another when we change our facial hair status, etc. It's very grating.
I
Stop
remember
being
when
predictable.
my dad shaved his mustache when I was a kid, and I did not know who the hell this person was. It's like, what? Who? No, stop. So yeah, I know, like especially with someone you're close to, it can be jarring, but we need to reinvent ourselves every once in a while.
We
Um,
absolutely, absolutely do. Can't have our entire existence governed by a single steady state attractor. We are multiplicitous entities.
yeah.
Mm.
So I was revisiting our conversation with Merlin Sheldrake. Was that last year? Was that earlier this year or was that last year? I can't quite remember.
I have no idea.
All blur.
We're going to be
But
talking about mental time travel if we get into that and its relationship to flow. And yeah, it's highly, highly confusing at the moment.
and that was a lot of fun to talk about improvisation in the context of well, biology, but also music. And I think as a way into some of the for energy principle, predictive processing, and activist discourse, debate, etc., going on in the journals. I guess we're going to try again and wade into the topic of improvisation and flow as well. Um, I guess I'll just maybe to get things rolling, share an anecdote, an episode from my afternoon yesterday. I have this electric scooter to get around town here, and was driving down like a two lane road, semi busy, and coming up to an intersection, and the car next to me wasn't slowing down and wasn't speeding up to get through the light and wasn't signaling, and so I was like, okay, I think I'll keep going. And at the last minute decided to turn right, cut me off, and I slammed on the brakes and hit the back wheel and did a little somersault and was fine. I mean, we'll see how my leg does in the next couple of days. So far, so good. I think it's no major tears or anything, as far as I can tell. Won't be doing any jogging in the next week, but um, in that last 2 seconds, literally, from the time I realized I was going to hit the car, there was no slowing down in time to avoid a collision. To the time I hit the car, I think I had about 2 seconds. Um, but it felt like, could have been 20 minutes. I was like able to, the time just dilated. And there was a whole sequence of thoughts I went through in those 2 seconds, which was to realize that the electronic brake I was pushing wasn't slowing me down fast enough. And I don't usually use the handbrake, which is like it's a whole different movement. And I don't even have the muscle memory for that. I've barely touched that brake because I've never had to slam on the brake so fast before. But in that 2 seconds, I had enough time to actually make the determination that I was not slowing down fast enough and lift my arm to reach for the handbrake, which did slow me down, significantly, maybe, I don't know, 8 to 10 miles per hour more than I would have been when I made impact. And so, yeah, just to be able to be in a flow state as a result of a surprising circumstance so as to make those micro decisions um, it just brings to light the plasticity of our consciousness, and particularly as regards the nature of time. Um, most seconds of the day pass without me even noticing the millions of little decisions that are happening unconsciously in the sort of cognitive unconscious of my organism. But that there are moments when all of a sudden our consciousness can expand with the time that dilates to make all these things apparent. Um, so it's a mundane example. Thankfully, I'm okay. But I think it speaks to um, the way in which these sensory motor loops are engaged in a kind of a very impressive form of information processing. And I'm comfortable using that computational metaphor so long as we're learning from organisms what computation means instead of like learning from neurophenomenology what computation means and not just from the particular implementation of computation that we know as like digital computers, right? Um, so figured we'd start with an episode from life, and I know you want to get into your experience with music and um, performance and improvisation and flow elicited by that practice of yours. So, yeah, I don't know if you want to go right into that now or if you have any reflections on what I've said thus far.
Well, yeah, it's certainly something that, and I'm glad you're okay, and I hope the knee comes good. I mean, I've already said that to you offline, but I feel like I should say it in the
Yeah, so
on the
people know
indelible.
you're a nice guy. Yeah, they can
Yeah, I care about Matt.
update your Tim models and
Yeah, exactly. All the people who don't know about the conversations we're having offline. Well, not offline. It's a funny way of
yeah,
putting things.
we're only a couple continents away from each other here.
So, but one of the things that certainly comes up for me in reading these various papers. So, we read three papers for today. We read, Sean Gallagher on surprise, why in activism and predictive processing are parting ways, the case of improvisation, something like that. That's close to what the title is. We read uh, Darius Parvizi Wayne's paper, Forgetting Ourselves in Flow. And we also read the Anderson someone and Miller, someone and Vivek
Miller,
Miller,
yeah.
Anderson Miller, sorry, and Viveki paper on relevance realization and predictive processing as two different and convergent solutions to the frame problem in cognitive science. And one of the things that came up for me quite a bit when reading these papers, and of course the Parvizi Wayne paper in particular has a lot of detailed, discussions of the nature of flow, but I didn't see anywhere where it was discussed that there's a kind of, is it flow? Well, that really depends on your definition, but there is a spontaneous um, elicitation or solicitation or induction, whatever, of this kind of hyper presence, of absolute presence, in which we are forced to, I mean, we're forced into this we're very focused. I mean, on the one hand, yes, you've got this time dilation thing happening, but in another way, you're very focused as we are in flow, and we're drawing on expertise that we have, but it's sort of just expertise that we've developed over a lifetime of controlling our bodies, basically, right? We are skillful, practitioners of embodiment, if that even makes sense to say. And we are called upon, we have a necessity to draw upon that. And in a way that backgrounds, that makes the sort of self as object, the model of the self that we're often, kind of living through, which in psychoanalytic terms we would think of kind of ego consciousness. So we're living through this narrative and we're constantly reflecting and telling ourselves things about ourselves and our relationship with the world. And that drops out sort of spontaneously when we're in one of these high risk situations. And there is an interesting FEP or predictive processing type of account of that in terms of nested timescales, where that self as object modeling process, that ego consciousness thing, is really, it is a constraint on perception. Certainly, it's a constraint on our capacity to attend to the world, and to process incoming afferent sensory um, uh, information, sensory signals, but it's working at a kind of slow time scale, right? It's not appropriate to the kinds of rapid responses that we need when we're, threatened, or indeed when we're improvising or trying to do some kind of highly complex, execute some kind of highly complex skill that we might have. But it's also when we're just trying to perceive all of the richness. I mean, all of the richness. So, trying to get a little bit more of the richness of our embedded environment in, you're trying to really pay attention. If you were engaging in something like open monitoring or something like that, the ego is going to drop away because there's so much going on and it's happening so rapidly that any attention you might have to that kind of slower time scale in which this symbolically mediated sense of self is processed, that's just a constraint at that point. I mean, it's a barrier even, which is not to say that there aren't still lots of constraints on our perception operating in those circumstances, of course. And I think we can get into all that maybe in some detail. I'm under a lot of the constraint of very little sleep with a sick toddler, so we'll see. And I'd want to do justice to those three papers that I mentioned that we've read, all of which contain much of that are insightful, contain a lot of great stuff, but that all of which I would also have critical rejoinders to certain elements of them. And I think one of the things that I just, found was not really, I can't recall being mentioned even in the Parvizi-Wayne paper, which is a very, very rich, very detailed paper with a lot of discussion of flow, is indeed the spontaneous induction of a flow or flow-like state in a kind of risky circumstance like the one that you're talking about. But certainly one of the things to discuss is yes, whether predictive processing or free energy principle derived models can account for, say, improvisation, our desire to and capacity to surprise ourselves in those sorts of situations, and that's what Gallagher is suggesting it can't do. Uh, I don't think he's right about that, to be honest. And then in the Parvizi-Wayne paper, though, where there is a very rich model of a predictive processing or active inference account of flow states, there really isn't much there about improvisation per se. So I think that's something that we can talk about, because there are a number of musical examples, which of course I love, but the musical example they keep returning to is a concert violinist who might have a bowing error, and needs to adjust, or might hit a wrong note and be catapulted out of flow because they've made a mistake, and that might engage a kind of, so they talk about choking, and all that sort of stuff. But also of course, the acquisition of a highly complex skill set over a long period of time, as in developing the mastery of an instrument like the violin, and then the deployment of that skill set in a kind of flow context where to be performing kind of at one's peak, one needs to be fully present and focused, because the basic idea with flow, as originally defined by Csikszentmihalyi, is sort of that you're at the edge of you're in such a complex it's such a complex task that you're trying to execute, that you're right at the threshold of your competence. That's got to be hard enough that you're not bored, because if you're bored, you might engage in sort of more narrative-based mind wandering. But it can't be so hard that you have a crisis because you just can't do it. And that's and either way, you're going to be kicked out of flow. And so there's this Goldilocks zone, which is also talked about in a slightly different way, but in the Anderson-Vervaeke paper, in terms of precision weighting and its adjustments and blah blah blah. Again, which we can get to. There's a Goldilocks zone in which you're in flow, and then you are taken to be performing at your peak. And I think that's a useful model and it's an interesting model, but I don't think it necessarily captures. Whilst I think it's basically right in a certain sense, I think because of its emphasis, and deployment or utilization of this relatively narrow and again originary definition of flow per se, it sort of maybe misses connections to, this is gesture towards, but similarities between flow states and various kinds of meditation practice, between that and psychedelics. And then also, I would see these improvisatory states as potentially a way of bridging from these classic flow type experiences to actually meditation and psychedelics. Because I think there's a lot of the improvisatory in those contexts. There are a lot of ways that we can make that connection. And I always like to make the connection between my improv practice and my passion for naturalism, which, as I always have to say, is I'm not talking about metaphysics right now. I'm talking about being out in natural environments and embedding myself in that environment, listening and looking and trying to be as present as possible, but whilst drawing on a lifetime. I've been looking for things like snakes ever since I was a little kid. I'm looking for cryptic organisms, drawing on a lifetime of skill and insight that I've derived from a practice, and also a capacity for pattern recognition that we talk about getting your eye in or having the way. Naturalists will talk about this sort of thing. And it is this almost kind of quasi mystical type experience when you're very, very present and you see something that there's no way you would have noticed, there's no way you would have seen if you hadn't been sufficiently present. And there's a way that you're kind of holding the goal, which is detecting the organism and patterns associated with that, but very lightly and kind of at the back of your awareness. Because if you over constrain your perception with, like, if you're like holding in your mind an image of a snake or something like that, like in the forefront of your consciousness, you're not going to see the actual thing as it presents itself to you. And so there's a kind of improvisatory way in which you've got all these constraints that you want present because this is a goal-based activity. I want to find the organism, but at the same time, you need to ensure that they're not constraining your capacity to attend to all of the differences in that very rich environment that you're going to be encountering. So it's again, there's a way of thinking about this in terms of, you don't want a preformationist model of perception here. You don't want too much then, in FEP terms, top or predictive processing terms, top-down constraint of your priors. So, but you need a little bit. You need a little bit, otherwise you're not going to see anything. But not too much, otherwise that's going to constrain you seeing the thing as it actually appears. And one way that I thought, yeah, we could get into all of this in some detail is to talk about sort of the history and also the phenomenology of different musical practices. Um, and that's something I'll feel comfortable talking about when I'm a little bit, vacant this morning. So we could do a bit of a spiel on that and then delve into some of the ways that might map onto some of the things in the papers.
Yeah, we could go there next. But something that interesting connection that struck me that might seem a little bit out of left field initially, but um, when Rudolf Steiner talks about uh, the development of new organs of perception, and he thinks imagination would be um, such an organ that could be cultivated not just as fantasy make believe sort of um, uh, a way of conjuring into existence um, fantasies, but actually have import as a perceptual and even cognitive organ. And what he talks about, though, and he speaks of this in terms of initiation, when you first begin to um, awaken to this capacity of imaginative cognition, he says, well, you're trying to actually perceive what he would call the spiritual world, but it's initially very difficult to tell what you're perceiving and what you're creating. Um,
Yeah.
and so that is immediately he frames it as a moral dilemma, actually.
Yeah.
Are you seeking power as a result of this new cognitive organ, or are you seeking intimacy and relationship with something other than yourself and your own power seeking um, egoism? And that's a crucial moment on the initiatory journey. But it strikes me that implicit in that is an admission that our normal cognition and perception is very much shaped by our affect and our expectations, and that even while I've so far been and in past sessions kind of, and both of us have resisted a certain interpretation of predictive processing as just this Kantian enclosure, you know global skepticism of anything um, mind independent. We just can't even refer to anything outside of our own models of the world, and um, that sort of a view that reality isn't real. The ways that this gets language that can be quite shocking and draw people in at the same time in a weird way. Um, Even though we want to resist that, I think it's obvious that yeah, there's in our perception, there's a balancing act going on between expectation and uh, sense data. But there's also, as the active inference approach points out, a way in which perception is always already actively engaged in and involved in changing what the sense data are and changing the world, the external states, so called, in the FEP model. Um, and so that I think does more deeply embed us in a reality out there, right? When you remember the action side of perception, and that what the organism is doing is seeking um, attunement through participation in that which is beyond itself. Um, and we get out of this, and in Whitehead's sense, that would be referring to the superjective nature of experience, that it already transcends itself. We're not stuck in this closed loop of some kind of hallucinatory virtual model. The world provides us with its own best model. It doesn't need to be represented, or some of these theorists will talk about even re-representation, which I'm just like, come on.
They talk about generation.
Yeah, that's a
Well, the
better one.
world's already there, like,
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, this again, getting into details here is what I would say, you know, aphoristically or slightly nomically, is confusing a constraint function for a generative function.
Mm,
So predictive processing per se and relevance realization are selective constraint functions. They're like, is this, in the subset of all this variation. So this is, I'll plug it into an evolutionary model or a Persian triad. The subset of all this firstness, which is variation that's coming towards you, this subset is selected as relevant. But it's not that the model needs to generate the variation itself, just as
mm,
natural selection in an evolutionary context is not generative but restrictive. So it's a funny thing because in a way it creates pathways, so it has a kind of quasi-generative aspect to it, but it's always acting on a variation that is prior to the action of selection, right? So variation comes first and selection acts on that. And just as in perception, the rich, you know, differences, the hypervariability, the hyperabundance, the far too rich, source of information streaming at us all the time is the world. You don't need to create that; it's there. You're embedded in it. Uh,
mhm.
just as an aside, and I do think we're not going to get into, like, complex questions of Kant exegesis here or whatever, but I also think that Kant, basically, he says that himself. It's just, I mean, that's the function of the noumenal. That's the transcendental function of the noumenal. It's the generative ground in that sense. It's just that we can't know it directly, so we're blocked off from it. But it is part of his model, fundamental to his model, that it's there. It's not that everything is just looping inside here. It's there,
Mm,
and he needs to take that as a fundamental posit. Boom, external world exists, but we just can't reach it. And I actually think that's basically there in the structure of the predictive processing active inference account as well. But I think because it hasn't been fully, like, in the way it's discussed in the literature, it hasn't fully gone through that deep philosophical treatment and the ontological treatment. Like, as Kant was kind of subjected to that, and of course, without making any sort of qualitative judgment on how well his challenges were responded to. We might have our opinions about that. But in the subsequent evolution of nature philosophy, post-Kantian nature philosophy, German idealism, and beyond, the FEP is kind of still at that threshold where it hasn't really gone through that. So I also, though, wouldn't then say that some of the implications of anti-realism or like quasi-solipsistic implications are Kantian so much as I like to say naive Kantianism.
Oh yeah, yeah, right.
Yeah.
Or reheated, as I put it, like microwaved when it's not fresh anymore. It's not as, and nor is it as deep as what Kant was doing. And because there's already so many hints in Kant about like this transcendental um ground, or maybe even transcendental abyss in a sense. It's groundless, but constitutive of any ground. He'll refer both to the transcendental unity of apperception, and he'll also refer to the transcendental unity of the system of nature, right? Empirical science doesn't discover the unity of, or the systematicity of nature. It's a prerequisite for there to be such a thing as a law that you might discover, from Kant's point of view. And so while Kant doesn't make this explicit, he gets closest in the Critique of Judgment, but it seems like the noumena, or the noumenal realm, is it's there's a coincidence between the transcendental subjectivity on the one side and the transcendental, I want to say objectivity, but the thing in itself that would be beyond our, or the ground, the source of our sensibility, right? So the transcendental out there and the transcendental in here might be the same transcendental, and this is what the post-Kantian idealists mean by the absolute. The coincidence of subject and object, knower and known. And I think that move is easily caricatured and might seem as just sort of a naive mystical cop out, or um, a dissolution of rationality, and a giving up of the pursuit of technical knowledge and like instrumental know-how about like what good does it do for us to know that subject and object coincide for scientific inquiry. And I think FEP is wonderful, and all of the predictive processing models, I think, as ways of um, doing good instrumental science, which means developing models which give us some grip on the systems we want to study and allow us to predict and control their behavior. That can be used for, for ill, if, PR and advertising, if the industry, I mean, they do have a hold of this, so they can, we can manipulate people with this knowledge because we can understand how, um, the human brain might be performing something equivalent to or approximating Bayesian inference. I think, clearly there's some sense in which that's a fair statement, but that's different. That sort of instrumentalist model based know-how, and how to interact with these systems and predict and control their behavior is not an understanding of what cognition really is for an organism. I think that would require going into this deeper sense of um, the coincidence of subject and object, like for consciousness and knowledge as we experience them in the most concrete sense to be possible. I think it implies a coincidence of these two transcendentals, um, subject and object, or subject interior and exterior, probably better said. Um, so I think Kant, we should actually go back to Kant in so many ways, and understand that, because Kant wouldn't make the mistake of flattening what is really a transcendental mode of inquiry into um, an empirical one. Not that we can't learn from empirical study, but there's a difference between what Kant meant by subjectivity, or mind, let's just say, reason and understanding, and what a lot of the predictive processing researchers mean when they refer to the brain. because the brain is an object in this
Yeah.
empirical space
Yeah.
constructed by priors, and so there's an inconsistency about that sometimes, a
Yeah.
presupposed materialism that I think Kant actually avoids without just falling into a naive idealism either, um, or dogmatic idealism, let's say. So yeah, maybe we should just go back to Kant actually.
I mean, at least refresh instead of
Yeah,
just repeating, reanimate. And I mean, yes, I mean all of that, and that's somewhere, we could go deep into that. I want to force it back onto onto the music discussion in a second, but
yeah,
uh, I think part of what you're gesturing towards, though, is that there is a I don't know if sociological or political is the right way of putting it, but there are some repressed theses here, which are like hermeticism, microcosm, macrocosm, and animism. The environment is a subject or is comprised of subjects that are continually kind of being turned away from because we don't want to go back to that mystical claptrap or that primitive, pre-enlightenment kind of views and that sort of thing. And I mean, we need to go back there too. Again, not in an atavistic move, but to see what babies were thrown out with the bathwater and how can we respond even to again, how could we give something like the free energy principle and ontological treatment where you're already then, I mean, Gallagher actually, he doesn't talk, well, he mentions the free energy principle, but he does say that the active inference account is already much closer to an activism than predictive processing per se is. And if you go all the way to the free energy principle as a kind of generic physical principle, all systems, and bracketing or gesturing towards the fact that the FEP is in fact a systems identification tool, right? So you're stipulating what is a system and what's its environment, and you can draw those boundaries in lots of different places. And there's lots to unpick in the implications of that. But it is saying that, okay, yes, if the brain is doing this kind of thing on a predictive processing account, in fact, all systems are doing this kind of thing. So if that is what it is to be cognitive, then all systems are at least minimally cognitive. There are perspectives, therefore, associated with all systems. There is, you go into the Levin side of things, polycomputational interdependence, and you're already then into this. Most of these people wouldn't want to affirm this, but you're already into that animistic conception there, where you are seeing, again, the environment. Again, this is not where I wanted to go right now, but the environment is an agent in the sense that there's a symmetry across the Markov blanket between the individual system and the environment. They are equal and opposite. So anything you can say about the system, you can say about the environment at this level of the formalism. So in a sense, the environment is also an agent if the organism is an agent. There are ways of unpicking that, which I think we should bracket now and get back to. But also, yes, the environment is comprised of all of these other systems, to the extent that it is not itself unified at the same scale that any given, individual organism is. It is comprised of lots and lots of these other systems, which all have this cognitive, again, lots of scare quotes here, because working out what would be the most appropriate or least loaded terminology is one of the big challenges here, and it's a real task, in my opinion. Some would say, well, all the words are metaphors, so it doesn't really matter what words we use. That's not somewhere I'm necessarily willing to go, but you
yeah,
know what the FEP as this generic account makes the principle of cognition is something that's shared by all, not just brains, by all these other systems, by all systems. And so then you're in a very, very different implied ontology then than you would be if you just took, say, the predictive processing account where this is what brains do. And there's this,
yeah.
yeah.
I mean,
Um,
this will steer us back into the music and flow and improvisation bit. Um, I think as long as so perception, action, and error correction, um, you know, give us a pretty good model of how of a a general theory of evolution, how organisms propagate themselves through environments, um, and construct their environments. But that action piece, I think, is what's really interesting and important for the task of generalizing this model so that it applies across physics and biology and sociology, even action in physics, you know, action in biology might actually be linked in some way, in the sense that what we're really talking about here, I think, is a form of agency or aim or telos that's immanent. It's not
Yeah.
imposed from outside. But without agency, you have no cognition. It's just like perception and error correction, error minimization. Um, it's it seems to me to be one of the essential components in a cognitive system. And so that agency, and Parvizi Wayne mentions this term agency and wants to use it, but doesn't mean it ontologically. It's just descriptive. And I feel like that, Mike Levin's whole approach to that, like, well, if it helps us make the right predictions in our experiments to attribute agency to these systems, then let's do so. Um, I
Which is
think,
again disavowal again of those positions that we don't want to be associated with as scientists, for example, as
mhm,
rational thinking, modern subjects, whatever. We don't want to be associated with vitalism. We don't want to be associated with hermeticism. We don't want to be associated with animism, etc. So we will take a superficial reading of again Kant's notion of a regulative principle, filtered
mhm,
through Dennett, who is a massive influence on all these thinkers, and we'll go as if. We can use this term
right.
as if agency. Yeah.
But then in Kant's case, what he ends up doing is saying biology isn't a real science, in the sense that it could find systematic, lawful, constitutive principles. It's just giving us regulative principles that can guide our research, but we can't know what life is scientifically. And we
Yeah.
can't know what mind is scientifically. And so you sacrifice a lot, um, by settling for that instrumentalist account instead of just saying, um, that agency is an or aim or action, if you want to generalize and not have such, I mean, that's the term used in physics, that there is some degree um, of that in 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 nature, and that's why there's cognition as we usually think of it at the biological level among the higher animals, because there's this minimal form of a um, free energy minimization going on in any enduring entity, right?
Yeah. 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 And whether, yeah, I think action is one available term. Of course, the FEP is a principle of least action, which we've discussed a little bit. There's a ton to talk about there. I mean, and again, what are the appropriate terms? Is that agency is a very loaded term. So
Yeah,
is that the right term to use? But there's also lurking in the background here. People are still afraid of Hume. And and the problem of induction, and so causation is still in it. Like basically, agency and causation are obviously very related, and you kind of can't have causation without agency. And that's I don't really
mm-hmm.
want to try and cash
Well,
that out.
I was going to bring us back to the music piece. And I think in Parvizi Wayne's article, as you mentioned, he brings up these examples of the violinist making a mistake or missing a note. And I think that's an area where, in a different um, musical culture, or where there are different norms at play in like the context of jazz or improvisational music, then you continue on, you say yes to whatever happens, and find a way to work it in. And that's a challenge, from Gallagher's perspective, for predictive processing models, which seem to be more about maintaining um, a more conservative sort of steady state, understanding, which Parvizi Wayne directly, in some sense, directly responds to that and says, no, we can account for this quite easily. But I wonder if you think um, Parvizi Wayne's account is adequate, either in terms of how he's characterizing spontaneity or improvisation, um, or in how he describes it in predictive processing terms as basically a turning off of the self model and like dropping into the bodily, um, or more lower in the hierarchy of just our bodily model, which he thinks would be somehow more attuned to the environment. We're not getting in our own way, so to speak. Um, but it seems like in that case, it's like our conscious decisions no longer can factor in his account of how flow and improvisation would work. And, I think there are, I don't know if you've experienced this, but it's not like you're not able to, it's not like executive function turns off when you're in a musical flow state, right? You can sort of be thinking about where you might want to go a little bit later and still be in the flow with where you are now. I mean, how would
I
you
mean,
describe it?
well, so Pavisi Wayne does actually, they do address that in the sense that the flow state might not be that might be an extreme component of a ongoing process or ongoing experience where you're moving, in and out of the flow state. So
Mm.
they do talk about dancers in this way as well, like I'm totally going to nail that move in, and there's a lot to say. So with the Parvizi Wayne paper, it's got so much in it, and it does have many caveats at lots of different levels, and it needs a close reading, and it needs to be picked apart. And I mean, I've got the notes for that, but I don't have the working memory to do that, to do justice to it, because it's a really good paper. It's a really good paper. Nonetheless, I have some issues. I really don't think improvisation is really addressed there in any detail, in any detail whatsoever. But let's so what we can talk about is uh, a little bit of a narrative. I'll give a little bit of a narrative about the role of improvisation in music practices in different musical traditions, maybe, as a window on the way constraint functions can work in music practice. And one of the important things then to begin by saying is that this is always going to be an extended mind kind of thesis straight away, because the constraints, so the what is fulfilling the role of a non-equilibrium steady state or an attracting set, in free energy principle active inferency type terms, is not necessarily something it's not in the brain or the body in isolation. It can be in the set of musical conventions. And Gallagher kind of mentions this, but he mentions that there are musical conventions that can form constraints, but he doesn't see that the FEP completely, can describe exactly that, basically. And I think one of the ways that the Parvizi Wayne paper, yes, would address all of those things, and I do think it works, but it just needs to be unpacked a lot more, and more situations, more contexts, more different styles of musical practice, if we're talking about music, which they're not exclusively talking about, obviously, can be brought into it to get a richer model of how constraint functions work. But the temporal nesting, um, and it's not necessarily just temporal nesting in a hierarchy. There's also a modularity that needs to be discussed, perhaps in relation to all of these papers, because the afference-efference divide is too binary. When we think about, afferent signals are coming from the external world and efferent signals are going out into the world, because one of the things that does get mentioned, and again, this is very relevant to improvisation. It's relevant to what you were saying about Steiner and the imagination. It kind of gets gestured to right at the end of the Parvizi Wayne paper. Maybe there are these purely mental states of flow, and we leave that question unaddressed. Well, of course there are. What is active imagination? What is incubation? What is hypnagogic, like liminal dreaming? There are ancient practices which are precisely about this kind of thing, obviously very developed in a more contemporary setting by Jung, but by the psychoanalytic tradition in general. And things like, well, they start to become more embodied when you talk about automatic writing or flow in conversation. But a hypnagogic, really internal state where there's no just a dream, actually. Just think about a dream. It doesn't even have to be a liminal dream where you are kind of, awake and allowing the imagination to do its thing. Just when you're dreaming, you're in a kind of flow state that you're completely immersed in, and there's no afference. I mean, afference can be somewhat influential, but it's largely one part of the brain, treating spontaneous activity as though it is afferent. It's like this is coming at me as though it's something that is not me. And you get that a lot in a kind of open monitoring type meditation experience as well, where you are simply attending to whatever arises, and things arise in the external world, and the birds call, the wind blow, blah blah blah, whatever it is. But so thoughts also arise, and you don't try to shut down thoughts, you just observe them, but you don't identify with them. So you can de-identify with spontaneous you know the equivalent of efferent functions of the imagination and things. You can de-identify with them and treat them as though they're afferent, and that can be part of a purely mental flow state. But yeah, I mean, I kind of wanted to talk about the Steiner thing, and well, very quickly, that account that Steiner's giving that you gave earlier. I mean, that's very of a piece with psychoanalysis, in the sense that we're projecting all the time, and that there is an ethical onus on us to tell the difference between what's projected and what's efferent and what's afferent, basically, in that sense. But I mean, that's an ancient contemplative principle anyway. Like that's you know emptying, or seeing through Maya, or reducing the influence of glaciers and those sorts of things on our perception, so that we can act in a more responsive and ethical manner.
Well,
And I
just
think one
mm,
more, just to really quickly finish that, and then, and then do the music
get
thing.
back to the yeah, yeah.
Yeah. One of the reasons that's attractive, I think you were saying that some people find this basically illusionist account of predictive processing attractive, is probably because we all have that experience. We all have these awakenings, and they don't need to be, it doesn't need to be awakening with a capital A and this, huge experience that might be characterized as spiritual or mystical, or what have you. It's just in any given moment that can happen to you, where you suddenly notice or become receptive to something that you can recognize, to the extent that you're paying attention to these things, that just before that your perception was constrained by some preconceived model, or whatever. Learning is a lot like that. Realizing that one is mistaken is a lot like that. And so I think a lot of people have that basic, I think that's a generic basic insight. And so when you get something like predictive processing that purports to provide a model, a rigorous scientific model of how that kind of thing, of how we are systematically, subject to illusion or delusion, it's like, oh, that's right, that fits with my experience.
Yeah. Well, just on this question of, Steiner and dreaming and um, the two different cosmological backgrounds that are on offer here. James Hillman, I think, talked about the poetic basis of mind. You might talk about an imaginative basis of mind in Steiner's case, where on some level, imagination is the plenum out of which what we think of as matter and mind are perpetually arising. And the alternative would be a material basis of mind, where mind is brain. And so in the case of dreams, we would say, without even batting an eye, when you're lying in bed asleep at night, the dreaming is in your brain. Your experience of the dream realm is inside your skull. And we think in this way, and it's, you might be in intellectual communities, at least, laughed at or completely dismissed if you were to suppose that maybe that's not true. Maybe something like an astral realm that can be made sense of. And the way I would try to connect this to some, slightly more, well, yeah, more academic kind of discourse would be in terms of what in the blind spot, Thompson and Frank and Gleiser refer to as the strange loop. And it's about doing justice to both the experiential side as well as the uh, natural scientific side of all of these questions. And so when it comes to something like dreaming, I think one of the implications of even just the more cautious position of the strange loop, yeah, Hofstadter, yeah. Um,
This is such a good book, even though it's coming from probably a,
Gödel, Escher, Bach is even more. I mean,
yeah,
that's like
yeah,
the Redux version of that, but
yeah, but yeah, I mean, this is a beautiful redux of that, I would say.
yeah,
I mean, I really have a lot of respect for Hofstadter. Again, he might be more in that cognitivist camp, but yeah, I just wanted that to be acknowledged, obviously,
yeah.
that
And I'm just elaborating on this very ancient understanding. There you go. Um, of like is it Chuang-Tzu who talks about am I
yeah,
the butterfly dreaming it's a human or the human dreaming it's a butterfly?
exactly,
Um,
yeah.
am I, a brain dreaming or is the brain itself in some larger imaginative process that's not simply material? I think,
And I
I just leave the
feel,
question open. I don't know, but I think we should question the frame that leads us to assume, again, without even much reflection nowadays, that the dreaming is happening in the brain, when from the dreamer's perspective, I don't know if that, you know,
yeah. I mean, I think we should question the perspective that growing up is about a certain kind of disillusionment with the imagination and recognize and even with these kinds of questions, that the sophisticated adult point of view is that, oh, well, we used to get stoned sometimes in college and have conversations like that, but now we're beyond that because we're like straight-laced adult
no,
people, responsibilities and all of that. And yeah, I wouldn't want to close the door to any of those conversations. I mean, I have my way of navigating through that and also trying to, and this is a lot of what we're talking about, obviously, is trying to reconcile these different worldviews. So I can have there's a both and, where it could be largely going on in the brain, but that wouldn't in any way devalue the profundity of the experience and the notion of imagination as a generative ground, which again is of course fully developed in Jung. It's also the notion of the imaginal in Corbin. It's and again, as you say, it's an ancient thing. Um,
yeah. And I mean, and it's such a subtle shift from this poetic basis of mind, or this sense of imagination as the generative ground. Um, it's such a subtle shift from a predictive processing understanding of perception, I think, that you're just questioning this residue of materialism as an
yeah,
ontology that's there in the background. Even though you're denying you're saying anything ontological, it's just so baked into scientific culture. Um, and so just instead of like a cranially controlled hallucination, we can think of yes, there's a generative imaginative dimension to how we perceive reality. And there are collective, I mean, we're immersed in collective representations that through subtle, mostly non-conscious agreements, we socially construct all sorts of not just ideas about the world, but our very way of seeing the world. And so we have to be very sensitive to the constructed nature of our shared reality, but that doesn't need to be simply located inside the skull.
well, I think the deep constructivism that you and I have talked about, ontological constructivism,
Yeah.
uh, which again, we look to people like Whitehead and Peirce, and I, of course, sometimes question their constructivist credentials, but they clearly are, thinkers of this very deep, construction, and you know, laws of physics are themselves habits of the cosmos, right? For Peirce, so the construction and kind of convention. And again, bunny ears galore, just in the same way that with the FEP, you'd be using cognition. Like cognition and evolution are synonymous in that frame, like formally
Mhm.
synonymous in that framework. Coarse graining is part of both of them, and so some of the formal guts of that way of thinking are also the same tools that you'd be using in non-equilibrium, thermodynamics. And there's so much to say there, and then we could easily get into a conversation of like Prigogine talking about Deleuze as the philosopher that was most influential on him, and also Whitehead, of course. Stengers and Prigogine reference Whitehead a lot. There is so much that can be unpacked out of the FEP, part of it just by situating it in its lineage of thought and that connection that's there, a couple of generations back and a couple of degrees of separation, but to Whitehead, it's already there, to Deleuze, to other thinkers of this kind. But then, you could go Deleuze into animism and the way Deleuze is important for the ontological turn in comparative anthropology. And then you can look at things like, Anil Seth in this seemingly very, quite materialistic, mechanistic paradigm, the implicit, assumed, or tacit ontology there, saying that perception is nothing but a controlled hallucination. Well, that feels very different when in a like comparative anthropological context. Eduardo Viveros de Castro talks about controlled delirium in, animism, in shamanic states, etc. These just feel like very, very different things. The words are essentially the same, but because the ontology is totally different, they land in completely different ways, and that's again why. The ontology, reconstructing the ontology, exposing both the tacit assumptions, but then also saying, but what you're saying at this level is actually more appropriate to a quite different ontology than the one you're tacitly assuming, is just such a crucial role. And that is, of course, the role of philosophy in these contexts. And there's just so much to dig
Yeah.
into.
Well, let's get back to the music thing by virtue of this question. Parvizi Wayne, I mean, maybe he doesn't assume this, but it seems like one way of framing the improvisation question is, to ask about the agency or the action element that we were getting into earlier. When you're improvising, you don't have a purpose in mind that's beyond the moment and responding to what's happening. And so that's why there's a difference between a violinist who has a score to play and can make a mistake that ruins it versus being, you know, explicitly in a context where you're improvising, and that's the plan, so that there's room to deviate from any preconceived direction that you're supposed to go in, and so there is no wrong note. Um,
As Thelonious Monk would say, there are no wrong notes, only wrong resolutions.
yeah.
Uh, but
So it's still a purposeful activity, but different from the type of purpose that's at play in the violin concert.
the constraint functions are different. So yeah. So one way, the way that the Parvizi Wayne paper does talk about some of this is in terms of the different, self models or levels of self that are operative in different contexts, right? So the self as object, the egoic self goes away, so constraints at that level are not present, but then there are still these constraints for there's the embodied self and the constraint functions, the capacity, the canalization function that exists at that level, which is the skill that's been built over the thousands of hours of practice and that sort of thing. And this is what they say is characteristic of the flow state. But yes, so what would be really useful to integrate here is precisely a discussion of how extended constraint functions work in different traditions of musicking, different musical practices. And so there's a big story to tell here. It's really deeply fascinating. But there are different ways of framing it. There are lots of parallel lineages of musicking, right, in the world, but even within, say, the Western world. And one way that musicologists often binarize things is by separating literate traditions with notated music, from oral traditions where there is obviously no notation. And that works to a degree, but again, there are still lots of different ways the constraint function work. So one thing to talk about is the role of improvisation in so-called Western art music, which is basically the literate music tradition. So I'll give a quick spiel about how improvisations worked there, and then talk about it in different oral traditions. And I'll try to be really quite quick whilst hitting, some of the high points here. But again, the thing to be thinking about is the way constraint functions work and where constraints exist in different musical practices. And some of those constraints are in the bodies of the performers, and they are everything from, egoic involvement to, embodied, skillful, coping, so to speak, skillful practice that has been built up over a very, very long period of time. But then there are also these extended or external constraint functions like the score itself or the jazz standard, the blues form, et cetera, whatever they might be. So in the notated, quote unquote, literate Western music tradition, improvisation was always a big thing there too. And I think this is probably not so understood by people kind of outside, musicology or just, having studied music a little bit more, because there's a way in which it gets increasingly marginalized as you get closer to the modern era. But if you go back, I mean, not all the way back to, like, Hildegard of Bingen and the early days of musical notation, but if you go back to, say, the Renaissance, um, you have scores, and they look like this. Say you've got the same basic stave, the same basic notational system that we use still today, but the scores are a lot less ornamented, a lot less complex in a certain sense, because there's always a lot of space left there for the performers. And that's both at the level of the accompanying instruments, the sort of the rhythm section, you might think of it. They might just be given, say, figured bass, which is saying, what chord inversion should you be playing at this point. But in terms of voicing, like what specific notes you're actually going to be playing, that's would be at the discretion of the performer, but again within a set of non-notated conventions. So there are always conventions working at different levels. For the solo or melodic instruments, there would be, melody lines that were written out, but there's a lot of space for so-called diminutions in those melodies, so they could be ornamented quite a bit. And then again, there are conventions surrounding the kinds of diminutions that are appropriate in a particular musical context. So as well as, learning to read a score, part of learning to be a performing musician is studying the conventions of the diminutions and knowing when it's appropriate to do this little twiddly bit and this little twiddly bit and whatever. So it's improvisation, but it is, as improvisation tends to be, as we'll get into, still constrained. But there are, again, two different levels of constraint here. There's, the score itself, and then there's the convention surrounding the improvisation, and that would continue into the Baroque period. But scores are getting richer and more complex, and in the Baroque, of course, that will reach its apotheosis with the music of Bach, and a lot of that music will have fewer degrees of freedom. But improvisation, of course, remains integral to musicking then, and Bach is considered, from written accounts, one of the greatest improvisers, one of the greatest keyboard improvisers, of all time. Certainly he's considered one of the greatest, if not the greatest composer of all time by many people. But he was a rector in a church. He was an organ player in a church. That's what he did for a living, and he would just improvise. So he was just improvising for hours and hours every day, and some subset of the musical material that he discovered in an improvisatory practice, he notated, and those become the scores, right? And that's very much the way we see things. I mean, even to this day. But if you're going into the classical era with the great classical composers, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, etc. Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven in particular are again renowned improvisers. So, Beethoven would do these improvised concerts. He would play for, maybe, a couple of hours, just purely improv. we don't have any record of that. And what's going to get important when we get into the modern era is the role of recording and how that interacts with improvisation practices. But we don't have a record of that. We've got all the music that he notated, but we assume, right, that in a sense, composition in the literate tradition is improvisation onto the page. So, you're playing and then you're finding a new, oh, I like this melody, and then you're writing that down. And then you're, of course, again, using various conventions and sophisticated ways of breaking those conventions to extend the language. And of course, we can tell a very evolutionary story here about the way, up to the late Beethoven, he's straining dissonance to a certain set of limits, and people are saying this music is unlistenable and unplayable and blah blah blah. Um, but what's happening all through this period is that scores, in a sense, are getting more complex and being more constraining. And so improvisation is getting more and more segregated to the side of the creative act of the composer, and the performers are finding themselves more and more constrained by the demands of the score. So if you look at, like, Beethoven string quartets or something like that, the players of his time were flat out just trying to execute that. There was no way they were going to be improvising on top of it. It was new language, and so they wouldn't have even known how to improvise contextually, even had there been any space for it, because the harmonic language would have been too difficult for them, and whatever. And this kind of goes on like that in the Romantic period, but you get I mean, the concerto form has always been there. So a concerto where you've got a soloist being accompanied by an orchestra. But there's a thing that happens during the age of the virtuoso in the Romantic era, where there are, and again, this is kind of a traditional thing in the concerto form. There are cadenzas, so there are places like at the end of a movement where the violinist gets to do their thing. Again, there are a set of conventions. You wouldn't just like be playing absolutely anything, but you would be expressing yourself in your own language, probably taking some elements from the score, some of elements of the theme, etc., and reworking them in ways that were spontaneous but constrained. And that becomes a kind of, it's a big thing in the this virtuosic era in the Romantic period, but again, the space for improv is being very segregated to very particular parts of the score there. And then you get, to make a long story short, as you go through the 19th century and into the 20th century, again, you're still getting this, the harmonic language is developing. People really probably wouldn't have known how to improvise in those contexts. And the composers are becoming, real control freaks too. So it's like, play the score as it's written. And someone like Stravinsky becomes a big, in the early 20th century, becomes a big, first half of the 20th century, becomes like a big advocate of the absolute power of the composer. I want the performance to be the same every time. It should be perfect fidelity to the score. The great irony there is that if you actually listen to Stravinsky's conducting, his recorded, conducting performances, they're all different tempi. Like, it's all over the place. Like, he wasn't a great conductor anyway, but it kind of proves that no two performances can be the same no matter what the constraint function. But this all kind of reaches its apotheosis later in a movement called the New Complexity. Composers like Brian Ferneyhough and things, where the score is so laden with performance directions as well as the notes. And I guess that's something that I haven't really mentioned, is that throughout this whole development of musical notation, performance directions themselves, which are an additional layer of constraint on top of the notes themselves, are becoming more and more rich and complex. And so eventually essentially all the expressive, creative component is on the side of the composer, and the performer is fully marginalized in that sense. But then in other musical traditions around the world, improvisation has always been a thing as well. In Indian music, in Chinese and other East Asian musics, in African musics, etc. All of these are oral traditions predominantly, but that doesn't mean they don't have very complex sets of conventional constraints on what is permissible in a certain musical context, in terms of improv, right? So it's not that things are necessarily notated, but you still practice for a really long time. There are particular song forms, there are particular songs, and those are templates for improvisation. And certain things are admissible and certain things aren't. You might be improvising with melodic content. You might be improvising with certain acceptable rhythmic patterns. the Carnatic music in India is like some of the richest rhythmic vocabulary of any music in the world. There are lots of conventional ways to subdivide different beats, different pulses, that kind of thing. They also there would be, and in the Indian classical tradition in general, be improvising using certain modes, so certain scales, certain combinations of notes, would be used to define a particular, say, like a raga, a big extended improvisation, which could be a group improvisation, but they'd be constrained by, again, certain pre-existing forms. So there are always these constraint functions. There are always attractors. There are always non-equilibrium steady states. But in the 20th century, what happens at the same time that the score is becoming more and more like, constrictive and all of that, we get the development of recording technologies. And this has a big impact on the way oral traditions are transmitted, because as you would expect, right? These are not literate traditions. The music isn't notated, but now it can be recorded and passed around. That has a big and interesting impact on so-called Western art music and notated music through various composers who were also ethnomusicologists. Bela Bartok would be one of the really famous ones from Hungary. And even though there was a folk influence on so-called Western art music throughout the Common Practice era, and Hungarian dances are a big thing for the classical composers, but also in the Romantic period and whatever. The fact that Bartok is now going out into the field with wax cylinders and recording these living oral, folk music traditions means that when he then starts to integrate his training in the sort of Germanic classical art music tradition, when he starts to integrate that with this folk stuff, the influence of the folk music is much, much stronger, and he develops, a really unique vocabulary. There's a way Stravinsky gets into the folk stuff in his early Russian period. There's lots of stuff to talk about here. I don't want to talk for too long because we've got to get to improv. Again, but because all of these folk music traditions or oral traditions, they tend to have an improvisatory component. Now, unique improvisations can be recorded and transmitted. And of course, in America in particular, this becomes a really huge thing with the emerging music of the sort of cultural melting pot, but the music from slaves on plantations, the development of the blues, things going on in New Orleans and Congo Square with African drumming, which has an improvised but again very constrained improvisatory element to it. And of course, the blues leads to the evolution of jazz. And jazz goes all the way through in terms of the presence of improvisation to free jazz. And now we have all of these different musical practices which incorporate music in different ways. This also has a big feedback onto so-called Western art music post-World War II. And we get the advent of things like aleatoric music, where there are ways of formalizing chance elements that are introduced into the music. But so in something like the blues, you have a constraint. You have a particular song form. Say if it's traditional 12-bar blues, you have a particular harmonic progression. You might have a song itself, so you might be playing a standard, like a folk song that's been transmitted orally. So a lot of the melodic content, the lyrical content is fixed, and the musical vocabulary might be quite limited, quite simple because of this strong harmonic constraint. But what happens then is when you have relatively simple context, and there's a way that this interacts with this notion of flow, where the claim is that it has to, the constraint function has to be so complex that you're at the edge of your ability just to kind of satisfy, just to again, not to play a wrong note, as you were saying. But there's a way that the relatively relaxed, relatively impoverished musical vocabulary leads to an exploration of different degrees of freedom. So ways of, approaching and sliding through notes. So kind of sort of microtonal inflections on notes, rhythmic phrasing, timbre, all sorts of other elements of the music get explored in different ways. And I mean, there are lots of really complex stories to tell here, and this has already been going on too long, but in jazz, you get the development from the blues through swing and all of that to bebop. And in bebop, you have, this notoriously complex musical language where, in a sense, it's classic flow in the sense that just to play the changes, because the changes are leaping all over the place, the harmonic changes, the chords, and the tempi tend to be very fast and all that. Just to be playing, something idiomatic, you're already likely to be at the peak of your musical capacity. But nonetheless, the real challenge is to then do something unique, is to improvise in that context. What makes it particularly challenging is that there are these degrees of freedom at the level of the preformed constraints that allow the free, relatively free improvisatory aspect to blossom, but you're in a competitive scenario. You're literally in a head-cutting context. So all of these musicians who develop bebop, they're at like after hours jam sessions. They've been playing in like big bands and swing bands. That's their day job. And then after the gig, they all go to like Minton's Playhouse in New York. Well, they're in New York. They go and they just jam until the early hours, and they're all trying to one up each other. So they're developing this complex harmonic language, a complex set of constraints, but they're trying to ornament, trying to improvise in a way that is unprecedented. And this leads, as in sort of art music or notated music, where increasing dissonance and all that leads to what Schoenberg would eventually call the emancipation of the dissonance, leads to the kind of breaking down of the constraints of the musical harmonic functions that have been constraining the music. So in the improvisatory context, but in a much more rapid way, really, you go through this process of the music getting more complex. You get a backlash to that in post-bop. None of this is relevant. I just can't help myself. But you end up in this by the end of I guess 1959. You've got Ornette Coleman with developing free jazz basically, kind of as a response to the increasing complexity of the bebop language, and then things are kind of starting to come apart, and you get this relatively constraint-free form of improvisation, even though in a lot of that you'd have a melodic form still. So there would be a theme, and then it was like, let's just play, here's the theme, go, you know, and yeah, so there are lots of different ways that this works. And as mentioned, there's a way that certain people start to try and formalize again the aleatoric aspects of the music or the chance-based aspects of the music. So you could have like a conductor conducting an improvised session that an ensemble is playing, and they're going like, now it's just you two playing. Okay, now you four are playing. Or you could have someone like John Zorn develops these game pieces where there are, you're passing out cards, and people have to turn cards at certain points, and there are instructions for what the character of that improv should be, or who you're going to play with, or whatever at a given point of view. So this is a real, hyper crash course in these things, but it's a very, very rich source of examples of the way constraint and degrees of freedom have been explored, developed in different ways in service of some kind of, aesthetic, expressive, function. So if
Amazing.
you incorporated all of that into the discussion of flow and the kind of Parvizi-Wayne model, and also, what Gallagher is trying to get at, and you could think of all these constraint, like if you think of the FEP as a basic dynamical systems model where you've got a constraint function, or kind of the solenoidal term in a Langevin equation, which is that at some slow time scale, there's something that's very regular. There's an attracting set which things keep returning to, but at a faster time scale, there's a dissipative function, which is the free play, essentially, the generation of variations. But if you think about musical constraints in musical practice along those terms, you can find a very rich way of conceptualizing an improvisatory practice. And then I won't go on, but plugging that into the phenomenology of how we try to achieve flow through improvisation specifically is the next thing to talk about. But I'll shut up.
Well, I know so many beautiful examples of the way that constraint and cumulative constraints can actually afford further a further deepening of creative expression. And I mean, just you said this would be an extended mind account of the history of musical improvisation, and I mean, the level of material culture and uh, music, the history of music is a kind of conversation, not just among and between musicians across generations, but a conversation between musicians, their instruments, forms of notation, recording technologies, and how so much of the history of music is this coevolution between humans and their implements,
Yeah.
um, and technological extensions. It's like,
To make that connection, to draw that out, what you're getting at is the instrument itself is a non-equilibrium steady state, or like is an attractor function. You know, am I playing a guitar? Am I playing a saxophone? My degrees of freedom are different, and that even if the only musical practice constraint is play, the fact that I have or don't play, the fact that I have a particular instrument in my hand is obviously, if you think about it at the level of the physics, another kind of constraint function.
yeah.
Yeah, recording, studio craft, all of this kind of stuff, you get very, very rich.
I'm going to read a stanza from Walt Whitman's poem, which I think is just called Music. Um, my friend, the microbiologist, Simon van der Els, mentioned this in a dialogue a few days ago. Oh no, sorry, it wasn't Simon. It was Sam van Belju, the other microbiologist I was talking to. But this is Whitman. He says, "All music is what awakes from you when you are reminded by the instruments. All music is what awakes from you when you are reminded by the instruments. It is not the violins and the cornets. It is not the oboe nor the beating drums. It is nearer and farther than they. Do you suppose that in these, touched by the fine players of the world, are the primary of the feelings that move you? No, there is something else. This something is in the soul and eludes description. Do you know what music does to the soul? Music, the most spiritual of sensuous enjoyments, give it some faint sign of the harmony and measure that are of its essence. Give the soul some faint sign of the harmony and measure that are of its essence. And Whitman has this, I think, his cosmology would certainly be a different way of affirming the poetic or imaginal basis of mind, or soul in terms of the word he chooses there. But being reminded by the instruments how to conjure music, I think, is part of what the extended mind um, approach to this question would suggest. And so, yeah, no, that was all enlightening for me. It's not a history I know with any degree of intimacy, and it seems like something that you spent a lot of time studying, and usually our accounts of the extended mind theory are, we think in terms of the technologies that extend our cognition, um, and maybe in terms of like media ecology and the evolution of communication technologies, but to look specifically at the evolution of music and musical instrumentation and notation and recording, I think brings it to life, brings the extended mind theory to life in a whole new way for me that I hadn't actually considered before. So um, appreciate that. Really, it really is enriching for my understanding of that approach.
Well, I'm glad. Yeah, there's I was obviously a little bit manic in trying to say a lot in a short period of time, but there is really so much to say there. And of course, one of the things that I've spent a lot of my adult life trying to understand. Whoa, it's hailing.
Wow. Oh, did you just lose your internet connection? I think we've lost Tim.
All right, so I'm tethered to my phone. Hopefully that will be sufficient because yeah, the DSL's gone out.
Uh-huh. Major thunderstorm or something.
Yeah, bit of rain.
Hmm.
Internet is just terrible in Australia anyway, so um yeah, hopefully
Uh,
this work. So sorry, where were we?
um, yeah, music, extended mind, Um, I guess, yeah, I don't know where to pivot now exactly, except to try to tie this back to the way that improvisation was being portrayed in the Gallagher piece. And I mean, maybe just digging into why it is that Gallagher thinks predictive processing is ill-equipped to deal with improvisational flow states, and how actually it's rather easy from Parvizi Wayne's perspective for them to account for those approaches to account for it, and what's going on there. Like, um, is this, do you think Gallagher's just caricaturing the predictive processing approach? Is that cut and dry, or?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of that. I mean, I think that he's maybe he's not caricaturing it in the sense that he's drawing on a very narrow sense of it. So he's drawing on the, Jacob Hui and to some extent Andy Clark, where Andy Clark, I don't know, intentionally or otherwise, writes against his own commitments to extended mind and that sort of
Right.
thing. So when Gallagher um, tries to differentiate an activism from the predictive processing account, the first thing, principle number one, cognition is not simply a brain event.
Mhm.
Well, okay, maybe in very narrow readings of predictive processing it is, but certainly if you're building up from the free energy principle account, it's anything but. The problem that a lot of people have with the free energy principle account is that it makes all systems cognitive. So
Yeah.
you
So, I mean, he's caricaturing the broader family of views, but maybe, I don't know. I haven't read Hui, is that how it's pronounced?
yeah.
I haven't read his work very much at all, and maybe this is cherry picking quotes, but he does say in this paper, The Self-Evidencing Brain, that the mind is inferentially secluded from the world, more neurocentrically skull-bound than embodied or extended. And so, at least as it's being described there, it's not a caricature. That's a view that we would want to resist too.
Totally. No, I think that that's it. I think that he draws on a very select reading, and we can say then that the way Hui wants to frame it, and again, Clark in some context, and those two I would say are the major philosophical popularizers and interpreters of predictive processing, and then I guess latterly the free energy principle. But I think that the way that Hui paints it has never been attractive to me. He's actually the first person that I encountered um, what predictive processing through
Mm.
at the 2014 Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness conference. And I had this idea at that time that I was working through that about neurosis and about neurosis as a excessive a form of excessive prediction and confusing one's predictions for things that are in fact happening. So a certain kind of illusion is, illusion or delusion there. And, I was doing a lot of meditating and obviously, pursuing flow practices through music and other means perhaps fueled by exogenous chemistry. And I was thinking about the way in which that, at least phenomenologically, that predictive aspect of consciousness drops out in those sorts of situations, and that I was thinking that that's health promoting, and I was trying kind of from a biological perspective to try and understand for myself why that might be health promoting. Why does that feel good? And that's actually a thing in the Anderson and Vervaeke paper as well that they just, and also the Parvizi Wayne paper that's discussed a little bit. But I was thinking about all of those things, and I'd never heard of predictive processing, and I went to this conference and saw this talk by Jacob Hui and also some talks by some of his students. And I was like immediately repelled. I was like, this is here I am coming in thinking that prediction, whilst a very important aspect of cognition, is readily, overextended, not in the extended mind sense, in situations where we rely too much on prediction, we become neurotic or we have difficulty coping with the world as it in fact presents itself to us. That's the way I was thinking at the time. And then here's someone coming in and saying the whole of cognition and consciousness is prediction. And I was like, no. But then I was intrigued because I was like, these people are my enemies, in a joking way. I mean, also David Chalmers gave the opening plenary at that, and I was immediately like, not impressed. I mean, I was aware of him, but hadn't, I was only just getting into sort of consciousness studies at that time. I was, halfway through a PhD in evolutionary biology and history and philosophy of science, and you know, I was aware of Chalmers, but I'd been reading a lot of Dennett and Hofstadter and stuff actually, and that made a lot of sense to me coming from where I was coming from. And then, I didn't really like Chalmers' take either, but I didn't like the predictive processing thing. And then I went and I read Andy Clark's very famous 2013, paper, which was kind of, I think, the sort of philosophical magnum opus of the time on before he'd published his books on predictive processing, which was the whatever next paper. Um, and I was very much more sympathetic to the view as Andy presented it. But no, I think you're absolutely right, and I think Gallagher's absolutely right that if you take the way Hui, and again certain select quotes from Clark, if you say that that is representative of what this research program is, then it caricatures itself, and you can easily say that there's a fundamental antithesis between inactivism and predictive processing. Okay, but I think the problem is that the broader conversation hasn't moved on the inactivist side, hasn't really moved on from that. They still think that the Jakob Hui type way of interpreting predictive processing is their target and their natural enemy. And it's like, no, you have to go from the free energy principle up and see the predictive processing thing as a higher order process theory about brains, but underpinned by this generic physical principle. And if you start from there, you get a very, very different picture. And Gallagher's paper is 2023. So it's like, what are we even arguing about? I mean, again, maybe it's totally fair within the disciplinary confines of cognitive science and all that he's aiming at. It's maybe an important intervention to still make. From
Yeah.
my perspective, I'm not in that context. I'm thinking about the free energy principle as a more generic research program in theoretical science more broadly. And so his criticisms completely missed the mark for that research program. And therefore, I know that anyone, or I suspect that anyone, Jakob Hui notwithstanding, working within that research program is just deaf to the things that they're just going to say, look, you haven't understood the free energy principle.
Yeah, I did do a bit of digging around, and I think, FEP may be in better at this, despite Carl Friston's tendency in his popular interviews to default to the cranial centric understanding. But I did look around, and there are a lot of um, cognitive scientists and cognitive neuroscientists who are using predictive processing approaches and talking about how and saying, at least in their popular interviews and in so many words in their academic articles, that we're living within our own internal simulation. And I was reading this other paper that we'll talk about some other time, by Shamil Shandaria, who's at Oxford, cognitive neuroscientist, I think. And he's actually a very spiritual person, and wants to actually think through non-dual states of consciousness in a predictive processing sort of context, and yet it fully embraces this idea that we live in a simulation, that the brain is always trying to figure out the causes of its sensory data, but it never can do that because we're just limited to the sense data, and so it's always just making its best guess, and we're ensconced within a generative model. And like, if we push that all the way into a constructivist ontology, I'm all for it. But when it gets locked into this brain-based residual materialism, then I think it's problematic. But all that's just to say, I think Hui's not the only one. And
No,
it's
fair,
mhm.
fair enough. And I think that Hui and yeah, I don't want to point at him. That particular way of framing things has been very influential. And so people, yes, they're doing this interesting cog sci work, but then, yeah, as you say, when they do popular interviews or when they have this interpretive, philosophical which is not. It's anti-philosophical, but and not in the positive sense, not in the like Laruellian sense or even Lacanian sense or whatever. It's like
Mhm.
non-philosophical. Actually, that's
That's yeah. Anti's
Laruelle.
fine.
Yeah, maybe anti better. Because it's just parroting a received opinion. And because that way of glossing things has been very influential, it's what people default to because they're not doing this de and reconstructive move on things. And certainly they're not willing to touch the ontological, the tacit ontology, the mechanist ontology that you know everyone's afraid to not everyone, but people are afraid to deconstruct. And even, these comments like in the Parvizi-Wayne paper, as you were saying, that we use the term agent without making any ontological assumptions about the nature of agency, and we thank Thomas Metzinger in the footnotes for drawing our attention to the ontological implications of the term agent. And we can also, of course, think about Dennett lurking in the background there a little bit, even though Dennett is such an agency thinker, that again, it's kind of it's some sort of deference to almost to like physics, but to deterministic, mechanistic view of the world. Like, well, we don't want to get into a stoush where the physicists are going to tell us off because actually the laws of physics are determinists. So we're not thinking at that level. And we certainly don't want to, be animists, hermeticists, vitalists, either on that side either. So we better just say we're not actually touching this issue. I mean, the FEP is a theory. It's an agent-based modeling tool. Like
Yeah.
it doesn't makes no sense without agency, and we don't need to pussyfoot around the issue of
Let me
agency.
let me read those like two or three sentences because it's so instructive here. The Parvizi Wayne authors write, it is worth mentioning here that any use of the word agent, quote unquote, in this paper should not be taken to imply an ontologically primitive entity in possession of its own properties, states, and processes. Rather, when we use the term, it is to naturalize our narrative. It should thus be considered shorthand for an individual organism's embodied cognitive system from which action appears to emanate and in which perception appears to occur, without making the axiomatic presupposition that numerically demarcated agents really exist in this world. In general, we have shied away from the use of the word agent because of the ontological commitments it implies, opting instead for the more neutral terms of organism, embodied cognitive system, predictive system, and individual, recognizing nevertheless that the word is frequently used in active inference and flow state papers, etc. All those other choices are just as ontologically, ambiguous and
Exactly.
question begging.
Yeah, and in almost exactly the same way,
Mhm.
because the issue with agency is whether that there is a system that is causally secluded from all of the pervasive influences of the environment, such that it can have, the freedom to act on its own behalf. So the issue in in many of these cases, is autonomy. An individual is exactly the same issue that you're going to have there. Organism is much more loaded than I think most of people in this discourse, in this discursive context, would understand. And there are very important critiques of the notion of the organism in biology. There are important ways to bring the organism back into biology with the new biology, the turn back to the organism that we're having here. But just because they happen to put it in a nice way, the Deleuze-Guattarian critique of the organism and the existence of the body without organs is very, very crucial to understanding what's going on in biology. And that is just to say, without going too far down that path, that there is a kind of there are layers within that are like spatially within the organism, let's say, that are not integrated into the organization, into the organic structure of the organism. And it's absolutely crucial that that be the case because that is the unpre-canalized, unpre-thinged source of variation. That is the generative variation that provides the wiggle room to actually be adaptive, to be plastic, to learn, to generate novelty, which is so crucial to this discussion of improvisation and flow and all of these sorts of things. And so the organism is a very problematic notion as well, in a slightly different way, but for basically for evolution, but for the generation of novelty, because there have to be free variables which are not canalized, which are not organized, basically. And of course we see that. And again, the FEP describes it very nicely, because that's the dissipative or Brownian or whatever. Don't worry about the words. Don't worry about whether it's actually dissipative in, whatever one's understanding of that term is, or Brownian or whatever. It doesn't matter. That's just the label for the formal function that corresponds to the unprecanalized variation that is taking place still within a constrained range, within a constrained set of degrees of freedom. There's a deep history of constraint in the organismal lineage, but in the cosmic lineage, as we would want to generalize it. But there's all of this unprecanalized at a particular level of description, so at the level of the individual organism, for example, in this case, variation going on, stochastic gene expression, genetic mutation, behavior itself, the constant influx of variation from the environment, which the organism doesn't itself need to generate. All of these degrees of freedom, which are not under the control per se of the organism and its various regulatory mechanisms, are the grounds, or the launch pad for any generation of further novelty.
Mm, yeah. And I mean, this language of like, I guess trying to ontologically hedge or like avoid commitment by saying uh an individual organism's embodied cognitive system, and like each and every single one of those words is just as loaded as agent, but then from which action appears to emanate and which perception appears to occur. Like perception and action are the givens that we are trying to uh, that are the ingredients of the theory, and they're not axiomatic presuppositions as it's put here, right? Um, an organism's embodied cognitive system from which action appears to emanate and in which perception appears to occur without making the axiomatic presupposition that numerically demarcated agents really exist in this world. Agency and this perception action loop is not, I wouldn't say it's not an axiomatic presupposition. It's a directly recognized and lived through fact,
Yeah.
right? That we're trying to model. And
Yeah.
so agency is probably, it seems to me, to be one of the most neutral terms we could land on. Um, if we're going to be reading cognition at the neurophysiological level of complex animals, or um, generalizing with the free energy principle, I mean, we're talking about action again, and is that an axiomatic presupposition? Well, it's a word that we're using, but we're referring to something that we directly recognize and that we can't just non-ontologically commit to. Like it's there, we're affirming it, and we're trying to explain it. So stop trying to erase it at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. It is. I mean, there's so much philosophical baggage. And as you're pointing out, like each of those terms is loaded from a different perspective. But there's so much philosophical baggage to wade through, I guess, in almost any choice of expression. So any way of hedging, again, exactly as you're pointing out, is drawing in all this other philosophical baggage. But one of the questions is, there's a fear of the given. There's a fear of the myth of the given, which is what Wilfrid Sellers called it, right? And so there's a fear that if we simply took agency for granted as a given, that we would in some sense be guilty of some kind of naive realism, some kind of naive direct realism, which is not necessarily the case, but there is then philosophical work to do. And I think that the what can be frustrating is that this sort of caveating presents itself as a philosophical gloss. Look, we're aware of the philosophical challenges here, and that's why we are. But those challenges just sort of ramify, and they're not escapable without actually, again, doing some kind of deconstructive and hopefully reconstructive maneuver on the terms that one is using. And that isn't the job of this paper, this Parvizi-Wayne paper. That's not the goal of the paper. And so, but so the issue then is what caveat is chosen that they've chosen to make as though it's ontologically loaded, and then everything else that's being, assumed or brushed under the rug. It's like, don't say that at all. Just use the term agent or don't use the term agent or whatever. But if you open the door to making that kind of caveat, then you're in a problematic place. I
Yeah.
keep looking for this other quote from in here somewhere. I've so many different things highlighted. It's a great paper. It's a really great paper. I keep
Hmm.
saying that. But there's somewhere where it said something like, oh, yes. In any case, it would be a mistake to conflate the mathematical level of description with the psycho-philosophical one. Well, it's a pretty major mistake to conflate the psychological and the philosophical here as well. Um, and really, the philosophical is about working out how the psychological or the phenomenological and the mathematical are related, how they might be pointing towards the same thing.
Yeah.
That would be a philosophical thing to do.
It's
It's not to
just
say,
this is just to say it's just like Einstein conflating Bergson's philosopher's time or duration with psychological time in their debate, like just sequestering it into his understanding of, well, there's physics, which gives us the true nature of time, and then there's this psychological time. And the way that psychophilosophical gets combined there is, I think, that same kind of um, lack of appreciation for the transcendental point that Bergson was making and the role that philosophy plays vis-a-vis empirical sciences, or can play. Sometimes philosophy muddles things up even worse, but because I mean that's what's happening here. This is philosophy, but it's like on the one hand, there's this desire for um, to admit that this is a model, and I don't mean to ontologize it, and I'm using the construct of agent, but I'm using the construct of perception and action, but I'm not saying organisms really perceive and act. It's just the model. But then we're also wanting to apply the model to ourselves and refer to our own, world models. Um, and I think that slippage becomes it becomes epistemologically problematic, because it's as if the only thing that isn't a hallucination is the model itself. The only thing we know for sure that's true is that predictive processing is the correct understanding of cognition. Um, and
to be fair,
so
I don't know that they would say that. I think that if pushed, they would appeal to a certain fallibilistic,
Bayesian inference, probably, right? So, but I think this myth of the given is a real concern, and there is a way in which, in continentalist and phenomenological discourse, direct experience can become a kind of shibboleth that is more a kind of virtue signal that we're not going to reduce away what really matters, right? Like we're the good ones, and we understand how important human experience is. But what is the referent there? When we talk about direct experience, it is in some sense the given, and we want to be as radically empirical about that as possible, and which is to say, be aware of the way in which we might have some tendency to impose a frame and imagine that it's given. But it's really crucial to be able to, I think, distinguish between the idea of agency as an axiomatic presupposition, as the Parvizi-Wayne authors put it, versus agency as a hardcore common sense, um, directly given experience that, you know, we assume because here we are as scientists and philosophers pursuing an inquiry
yeah.
that concerns us. And so we're assuming agency already and trying to account for that in the world. And so stop with all of the like overly cautious
Yeah. And the
posturing.
caution is at the wrong level, as you're saying, because it is, regardless of where we're going to end up ontologically, it is the given that one is trying to account for, as you're saying. And one might, good luck with that, try and explain it away, but nonetheless, it is not an axiomatic presupposition. It's where you're starting. Even if you ended in a place where in your speculative scheme,
Yeah.
your speculative metaphysics said there is in fact no agency, you wouldn't have begun with a, agency would never have been an axiomatic presupposition so much as precisely the starting point of your inquiry. And then you would be wanting, and this is, I take it, what they're trying to do in some sense, but you'd be wanting to account for the appearance of agency in a world in which there was no agency, which again, a lot of, mechanistic sort of philosophy is attempting to do. Again, I don't think it works for all reasons that you are articulating, and we've been over a number of times,
Yeah.
but nonetheless, it's not an axiomatic presupposition. Yeah.
Yeah. If our agency is ultimately a mere seeming and a mere illusion, which I mean, there's a whole thing that Galen Strawson's really good on this point that we haven't, if you say, oh, consciousness only seems to be real, you've only acknowledged what it is and haven't explained anything. It is the
Yeah.
seeming that we're trying to explain.
Yeah.
But when it comes to agency, it's like if ultimately the theoretical explanation we arrive at says that agency is just an illusion, then we have no reason to trust that theory because there's no such thing as a scientist seeking a theoretical explanation. You've undermined the very epistemological ground that would be required for such an explanation to be taken as true.
No, I'm in full agreement with you there. I think, back to the Gallagher thing for a second, I think, yes, he doesn't get the FEP extension, let's say, even though I don't think it should be viewed of that way. Predictive processing is a higher order, specific application of something that is grounded in the FEP research program. I mean, most of like his 1 through 7 principles of enactivism and dynamical processes. Number 2, the world, meaning intentionality, is not pre-given or predefined, but is structured by perception and action. I mean, yeah, active inference is kind of all about that. Cognitive processes acquire meaning by by their role in the context of action rather than through a representational mapping or replicated internal model. Again, yes, that's right, and I think that the fringy principle account can certainly admit of that, and even some of the things that he quotes from Andy Clark are certainly moving in that direction. I think it's strange, and it's there in the Viveki Anderson Viveki paper as well, to differentiate between the predictive processing, or again the FEP kind of approach to things, and a dynamical systems theory approach. Like, I hear this a lot, and the FEP is really a dynamical systems theory. So that's an unusual way of putting things. There are different formal tools that you can approach dynamical systems with, but those that are employed by the FEP are really all about, stochastic dynamical systems. So that's an interesting way of trying to differentiate things. Again, he'll talk about the full body. More complex cognitive functions are grounded in sensory motor coordination, affective and autonomic aspects of the full body. Yes, those are just more canalizing constraint functions in the generalized FEP account. So again, I think most of what he says is actually very, describable. I mean, I'm just scrolling through here. He says here, like, contra any strict Markov blanket. But there is no strict Markov
Yeah,
blanket.
they're all stipulated, as you were saying.
Yeah, and that could be seen as a problem. It makes the ontology difficult. Where are the real boundaries? And then it leads to certain sort of more anti-realist type statements. Well, there aren't any real boundaries. There are only the boundaries that we impose. That also is not going to work if you're trying to be genuinely philosophical about this. And there's a way we could talk about the environment organism relationship or symmetry in those terms. Um, but yeah, so there's no strict Markov blanket. I think that one of the things, though, that does come through in the Parvizi-Wayne paper, where you get the really high level, technical active inference account of these sorts of states, is that, again, I don't really see any account of improvisation per se in there, and it actually makes the flow state sound. And I don't think this is their intention, but I think it often comes out as though it is almost a completely predetermined state with no real degrees of freedom. It's just that you've intentionally, so there might be agency or autonomy or whatever at that level, you've intentionally pre-programmed yourself through a whole heap of practice. You've practiced your violin for many thousands of hours. You've practiced this particular concerto for tens of hours. Now you're in the situation, and in order for you to let that pre-formed, pre-programmed, bodily computation happen at its most effective, at its most efficient, the ego, this, that level of modeling, the subject as object, processes, self as object, etc., that has to drop away. But you've pre-programmed your body and now you're pressing play on it basically. And there's an exact way that that constraint function works in certain music practices as well. Well, you can think of the score, but you can also think of so-called total serialist music, where you have a matrix-based approach to serializing different isolated properties of the music, from the pitch content to the rhythmic content to the timbral content, etc. And you put all of these into sequences, and then you put the sequences into matrices, and you build a piece basically from this formal approach entirely. And there's almost no kind of, except for the initial setting of the tone rows and things, there's no real composition in the traditional sense. In this kind of model, it's setting up a formalism and then pressing play on it in the performance. And of course, when actual musicians perform that kind of thing, it's often really difficult and unintuitive to perform. And certainly in its early years, people didn't have the technical chops to play it. And so each performance was radically unique and full of a particular unique set of mistakes. But a computer can play that. And the way the flow state is kind of implicitly described in the Parvizi-Wayne paper moves in that kind of direction. You've pre-programmed with all of this practice. You're now in the Goldilocks zone where all of that skill that you've built is going to be deployed at exactly the appropriate level for it. And now it will flow through you, and you will be, you'll be so present in it that you're not doing anything. There's a lot of things about, is the flow state learning? Again, I don't have the working memory to again, I would love to do justice to this, and if we write about it, we will, because it's a great paper. But there are a lot of things that I want to pick apart here. But is the flow state learning? Is there an exploratory component to the flow state? Well, if there are flow states in improvisation, there's an exploratory component to the flow state. And they actually make exploration, or so-called epistemic foraging, contrary to flow in that paper in a kind of important way. And it's not in improvisation really the case that we're necessarily dipping out of flow when we're exploring and back into flow when we're just executing, because it's not predetermined. I mean, that does happen, but it's not that I'm saying, oh, when we hit that change over there, I'm going to play this lick or whatever. No, I'm allowing a kind of, again, a creative process of unpre-thinged, unpre-canalized variation to flow through me. Sure, my fingers have moved over those frets many thousands of times before, such that I can do this recombinatorial thing in a fluid manner and in a context appropriate manner. But I can tell you phenomenologically, when you set up relatively simple constraints to improvise over, so you're not at the peak of your ability to just try and make it context appropriate, basically, where you might then end up in a situation where you are just, it's still improv, but you're in this kind of diminutions type situation where you're just dropping the appropriate licks over the right chords, and you haven't predetermined which licks they were going to be, but they are in a sense pre-rehearsed licks. We speak about that as lick-based improvisation, right? That's a big thing. And a lot of people learn to improvise in this lick-based way. And again, in certain musical contexts, you might be restricted to that. If you're playing like John Coltrane's Giant Steps with its notoriously difficult changes to navigate, you might just have to rehearse a set of licks that, But if you're in a more open, wide open context, and this is another thing we didn't talk about in the evolution of jazz practice, but after the peak of the bebop period, and you get these kind of shift into the post-bop era, one of the major watersheds for that, as well as the moving into the free jazz thing on one side, is the modal jazz that you get. And modal jazz has a very different approach to constraint functions, in that often the actual musical material, the set of changes, etc., is relatively simplified, and that creates greater degrees of freedom for the musicians to explore, constrained by certain modes, a degree of free expression in that context. A lot of oral music traditions, of folk music traditions, are fundamentally modal. They're not harmonic. And jazz goes into this space. They're not functionally harmonic. Jazz goes into this space where there's less constraint from the harmony, more space for the musicians to do their modal thing. And it's like I sent you that little Afrobeat thing the other day. It wasn't a very good example, but you set up a rhythmic constraint. Okay, rhythm can be a constraint, right? We're going to play rhythmic. The whole idiom is a constraint. Saying that I'm playing something that's vaguely Afrobeat, right? That's a constraint, right? And I can deviate from it to some degree. But where I will generate flow in myself, certainly if I were just playing licks in that kind of context, it would be cripplingly boring, because I've probably done it a million times. But it's discovering new melodies and the way I can hook myself. So just like a hook works for a listener, as an improviser, you can find a catchy little phrase, and then you can do a set of variations on that catchy little phrase, and all whilst basically being in the flow state. And it maintains you in the flow state. Often, if I am even slipping out of it into a sort of slight boredom, because it's just like finger wiggling exercises to some extent, but then I happen to kind of stumble across something and go like, ooh, that's the thing that locks me back in. I'm now back in flow, and now I might repeat that phrase a few times, and I might start to vary it. I might get into call and response dynamics. All of these different things can occur, and I have again used an exploratory process to seed a continued flow state. And that kind of thing is quite distinct from the sort of pre-programmed flow state description that kind of you get from, even again, the caveats and things notwithstanding, that
Yeah.
one large Bob Easy Wayne paper.
It's almost like we have too flat an understanding of agency that's simply read in the manner of like come up with a plan and then execute the plan instead of a more improvisational and even distributed sense of agency where, you know, are you playing the music or is the music playing you? Are you playing the instrument or is the instrument playing you? Or and your fellow musicians who you're jamming with, um, in some way are, I mean, there is this issue of where to assign the agency, which, you know, and we want to have some degree of realism there and think of um, organisms have real porous, but nonetheless real boundaries. Um, but at the same time, we are ourselves as animals, a cellular collective, and there's agency at the level of each cell, but there's agency at the level also all of each organ, and then of our whole um, organism, and multiple competing um, sort of cognitive agents at the higher level of that hierarchy that are, you know, the voices in our head and the different subpersonalities and all of that. And so there is a shifting layered network of distributed agency that becomes very apparent, you know, um, when you're in a jazz band and trying to both have your individual moments where you're, you know, going off on a riff and there's even a little bit of competitiveness, but you're also always establishing the background constraints and sharing the idiom and like providing the stage for, you know, the next person to then have their little ditty. And
Yeah,
um
and in distributed agent, I mean, it's a really beautiful point. A beautiful thing starts to happen when you're being very exploratory, and maybe even doing things that might be considered a mistake, and maybe you didn't even intend something, because finger slips and all that happen when you're improvising and you're playing at the edge of your ability. But then another musician in the group picks up on it in a way that contextualizes what you just did, and that moves the music in a slightly different direction. And that actually retrospectively corrects your mistake and makes it completely context appropriate. And it's like a really beautiful thing that's happening. And that's the shifting of the constraint functions. We're
mm,
now collaborating. Our ness, our non-equilibrium steady state, our attractor is actually shifting as the music develops. And the stuff with the that I sent you, the duo stuff with the drummer, with my drummer friend Tony Hughes, who's also a pharmacologist. Um, in that kind of situation, there's no real harmonic constraint on me because I am the only, musician really playing pitches. I mean, sometimes Tony will play pitched percussion, but for the most part, I'm just exploring. But we're constantly feeding off each other in terms of dynamics, in terms of rhythmic phrases, and all of that kind of stuff. And our attractor states, because our degrees of freedom are so broad, basically collectively, we're mutually defining these attractor states all the time. We're shifting around. Okay, now we're getting really quiet and we're playing this little thing. Oh, Tony picked up on that little rhythmic phrase that I did. Now we're going to develop that in the next. That's going to be the launching pad for the next moment. And yeah, and that's a really beautiful thing. And then when you think about the influence of an audience too, people who aren't necessarily playing with you, but if you're up on the bandstand, and I mean, it's great with guitar, like guitar, for contemporary, Western and I guess global culture is such a totemic instrument, an electric guitar, like if you get up on stage and do some like widdly widdly stuff, people are, especially if they've had a few drinks, they're like, yeah. And then you're like, wow, now my flow state is being really potentiated because I'm getting this positive feedback. They like what I'm doing, so you feel jazzed, no pun intended. And that it's like do more of the same, or you develop a certain confidence which enables you to keep suspending that, egoic self-questioning. You're like, I am in the Goldilocks zone, basically, because people are telling me that it's working. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so it's like almost to extend Whitman's line that all music is what awakes from you when you're reminded by the instruments. It's not just the instruments that are reminding you. This distributed agency is such that the other players are reminding you, the audience is reminding you. And
Music
the,
is a fundamentally social practice. Uh,
yeah. Mm.
and there's a thing I'd like to say about recording in a second, but one of the things I wanted to get back to as well is that in a lot of the criticisms of these free energy principally, active inferency, etc. accounts, a nuance that's missed is the difference between variational free energy and expected free energy. And so Gallagher is talking about how the fact that we try to surprise ourselves and that we enjoy novelty in an improvisatory experience shows that we're not just trying to predict. We're not, because if we were trying to minimize prediction, we would never want to be surprised, right? I think even when he does talk about the FEP, he says the FEP makes it the case that like surprise is deadly to an organism, essentially, right? That if an organism is surprised, they're in an unviable situation. Well, firstly, there's a confusion between, people will just say this and write off the criticism. There's a confusion between surprise, which is like a subjective phenomenological experience, and surprisal, which is a technical concept associated with a deviation from some set of expectations that the whole embodied system might have, but that you might not necessarily be perceiving. Um, uh, but also the difference between variational free energy and expected free energy, and then the path-based formulation as opposed to the state-based formulation of the FEP enables us to think about, well, epistemic foraging or doing very novel things, novelty-seeking behavior right now, which might increase variational free energy, would actually lead over time to a reduction in expected free energy. So the fact that I'm exploring more novel states right now, whilst I feel relatively safe, let's say, if we're putting it back into those terms, right now I can explore because I feel safe. I've got a good safety net here. My bandmates aren't going to kill me if I make a mistake, or we're not on the bandstand or we're not recording or whatever it might be, that the risks are few. But of course, music is rarely a life and death issue anyway. So talking, deviating from your attracting set is, in a musical context is unlikely to have, particularly dire consequences for you. Maybe at the ego level it will. But exploring in the here and now can mean that in the future I'll be less surprised by things that might in fact
Yeah.
bug.
It's almost like delayed gratification with delayed minimization of free
Yeah,
energy.
it's an explore exploit thing, and I mean it's kind of well discussed to some degree in the Anderson Viveki paper, but where they get into redundancy and degeneracy, now this will be getting into more technical evolutionary theory terms. I think there's an issue in there I think there's an issue in the broader literature with the relationship between redundancy and degeneracy, to be honest.
Mm.
Um, I don't know if it's the appropriate time to to leap into that.
I think we
Uh,
better move towards wrapping up um, this particular session as we verge on almost 2.5 hours. But
with a
uh,
with a, with a small break for the
okay,
hail. hail-induced break. Um,
But yeah, I think this was a nice mix of science and art. Um, music as a metaphor for how FEP can find application in a really concrete way. Um, and yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't be engaging with this material at such depth if it weren't for your suggestions. And I think um, there are ways in which I might be overly critical and verging on caricature, but then on the other hand, a lot of the predictive processing theorists are themselves giving me and others plenty of
yeah.
ammunition.
I do think on that note, I mean, you said in your blog piece that I might disabuse you of some of your exaggerated things. I do think for people like you and me, it's probably a little bit too facile to focus on those predictive processing accounts. I mean, maybe it's important as a an intervention in the discourse still, right? So that might be important. But I think what we really want to do is start from the free energy principle and see what are the what are the ontological implications of there. So if we agree, and I think we do, that there's always a tacit ontology, and because of its insertion into a kind of contemporary theoretical science context, the tacit ontology has been this mechanistic reductionist materialism, and that provides a certain kind of challenge to be overcome in constructing a more suitable ontology without knee-jerkingly, crossing the threshold into some kind of, anti-realism or whatever. So we still want a realist ontology, but we don't want that one. Um, then I think that that's the philosophical task for us. Yes, there's the perhaps important, and I think when we write about this, we will of course say these things, intervention into the discourse, saying like, well, in the activist critique of the narrow cognitivist predictive processing account is correct insofar as that account is then generalized into some grand unifying theory. In fact, as you did say in that piece, and you've said many times, as a kind of model of the brain as a cognitive organ, predictive processing is very useful. It's only when it is generalized beyond that that it becomes problematic. But if you're really going into the general theory, then you're grappling with active inference at a layer more general, and the free energy principle at a much more general layer. And I think that the reason a lot of the inactivist critiques for me fall flat, and we should definitely, by the way, reintegrate, like revisit, and when we do this writing, that laying down a forking path paper,
Yeah.
because it's the same issue there. Even though it's a useful paper, it's a good paper, but there are bits where it's just like this is exactly what the FEP would be saying, if you were really there isn't the necessarily the conflict here that you perceive. And I think that the Pavese-Wayne paper then is very useful actually in giving a kind of detailed account of a certain subset, let's say, of flow states, or maybe it is the classic flow states. It's very useful for that. And then it remains to be built upon for how does improvisation look from this, or what does approaching this from an improvisatory stance suggest about ways that this needs to be nuanced or extended, and how might that also help us to integrate these kind of states with other states of altered consciousness, like meditative states or whatever. And then there's the whole altered states, altered traits conversation. There's a necessary critique of the use of typology, I think, in the Anderson Vervaeke paper, which we didn't get to.
Yeah.
Lot of stuff here.
Yeah, I mean, final piece that I wanted to just mention as we wrap up here is in the blind spot, Thompson et al. Also address the predictive processing approach. And I think their real aim there is to say this doesn't, to counter Zeth, NL Zeth, that this doesn't actually help us with consciousness. Because, in Being You, Zeth's book, he argues that, well, if we take the predictive processing approach, we can, you know, approach a solution to the hard problem by making the problem easier.
Mhm.
And I don't think it actually touches at all the deeper philosophical question. Um, and so they are in the blind spot, I think, trying to mm, protect consciousness as something that is best inquired into phenomenologically, and that we run the risk when we get all excited about these newfangled computational models of imagining that the shiny new toy has actually explained something when it hasn't. Um, and so I think that's the danger here, because this is a shiny toy. It's not new, actually. It goes all the way back to Helmholtz and maybe even earlier, to Kant, on some level. And so, but it gains a new exciting packaging because of generative AI, and because of the applications in robotics, and this larger cultural myth that I would want to resist. And this is more, less about the academic conversation and more about how it's popularized. But this cultural myth that's quite prominent now, that cognition is just computation, and computation understood specifically as digital computation, and that all we really need to do is make the large language models training data set larger, and eventually it'll, like, consciousness will pop out of it. And that's almost like the common sense of most, um, you know, literate intellectual people in the modern Western world right now. And I think it's completely um, mistaken philosophically.
When you phrase it like that, it's a bizarre point of view because the training data is already vastly larger than ours. So,
Right.
in terms of at least their exposure to language tokens and things,
Or
uh,
just to say that the only issue here is the brain is way more efficient at a way more efficient neural network, and we just don't have enough nuclear reactors to power the amount of computation, that would support consciousness.
yeah, I think a big part of the problem, and it's there in perhaps in what you're saying about Anil Seth. It's quite a long time since I've really read any of his stuff, but also it's there in Andy Clark when he you know, overreaches into saying we could explain the hard problem. I don't like that formulation anyway, the hard problem, um, but
Sure.
I take the point, obviously. Uh, Part of the big problem there, which I mentioned earlier, is the idea that the brain has to generate consciousness,
Mhm.
as opposed to as opposed to the world, or has to generate this rich, world that we encounter in consciousness. It's like, well, the world is there, and the world may well be, we take a free energy principle type approach, and I think this is very consonant with a sort of Whiteheadian approach and a process relational approach more broadly. The world may be constructed by a process that's very, very similar, analogically, operationally, at some impoverished level, diagrammatically. But here we go into Simondon and allegmatics and things, as well as obviously, person and diagrammatism and all that. The same kind of process is involved in the construction of the world and our perception of it. And that's that hermetic idea again, right? The
Yeah.
microcosm macrocosm thing. I'm just, it's hard for me to see a way past that kind of some version of that.
Mhm.
But it's very different idea from the notion that the brain has to generate, or,
Yeah.
this rich, life world that we encounter. The brain's problem is coping with how information rich that
Mm.
that world is. Um,
Yeah. I mean, gosh, I just think of Whitehead's philosophy of science and his attempt to overcome the bifurcation of nature, which allows us to avoid the hard problem of consciousness, and by putting by saying everything we are aware of, that nature is everything we are aware of in perception, and not falling into this trap of having to, when we're doing natural science, talk about what's in the mind, the secondary qualities, and what's in nature, the primary qualities, and instead just put everything on the same level, and acknowledge that when we're doing natural science, studying the systematic patterns, uh, that connect our perceptions, that we're assuming as a presupposition consciousness, knowledge, cognition. These are not, these are what science presupposes. And if we want to talk about the relationship between what we call mind and consciousness and knowledge and what we are aware of in perception, I mean, we need to talk about that. That's philosophy, that's metaphysics. Science doesn't need to be dragging itself into the mud of metaphysics by making this bifurcation between what's in the mind and what's in nature. Nature is everything we're aware of in perception. And I think that it's a shift in our philosophy of science and what we think of as counting as an explanation, but it frees up science to do what it does best, which is model and experiment, and allows us to address the topic of consciousness and the relationship between mind and nature in a more conscious and self-conscious way, because we know we're doing philosophy and we know that there is no, strictly speaking, scientific explanation in terms of like what we are aware of in perception or the causes we imagine to lie behind that perception that could explain our consciousness. Because, um, you know, again, to do science, we're already presupposing that conscious agents are real.
And this is exactly why the hard problem, as formulated by Chalmers, is a
It's
red
only, yeah,
herring.
it's
Is
only
a red
helpful as a like, oh, dead end, back up, try again.
But the way he frames it in the original paper, which we've rehearsed a number of times, but it
Yeah,
can't be a functional account, it can't be a mechanistic account, and nonetheless, it is an account that science should look to provide. It's like
right.
no, it's not. It's not. That's the job of ontology, of speculative metaphysics, and the notion of explanation then also needs to be, and I think you were gesturing towards that, also needs to be reconsidered in light of that because it's more a thesis about the nature of or of the being of beings, to go Heideggerian on it, but about of some sort of ontology that is, whether it's a model or not, is something that we do derive from both the phenomenology at the given, also from science and what it can explain and what is amenable to scientific investigation. And in a way, the philosophical ontological task is the way that, Wilfred Sellers, but I mean, following his father, actually, Roy Wood Sellers, does get this right. The philosophical task is like, how do these things hang together? And what is the most, but it isn't subject to the kinds of, if we think of science as verificationist, which of course Popper would be screeching at us for saying that, but it's not subject to principles of verification, that kind of speculative thesis. Um, and it will, though, for people like us, and obviously following Whitehead from his from concept of nature and the way he tells science to to do sciencey things, and not to bifurcate nature, but the way he then develops it into his speculative metaphysics and what will then be later labeled pan-experientialism. That is a nice solution to the problem, not the hard problem. I mean, to the perspective problem or something like that. The fact that we see the subject-object problem in some sense, right?
Mind body problem, yeah, more generally. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's been around
exactly.
forever.
But then my motivation there is to look at all of the different ways that problem, in kind of convergent ways, that problem is approached, and that's why I think, for rhetorical reasons as much as anything, but rhetorical reasons that should push us into the domain of like comparative anthropology and all of that. I think we can talk animism, we can talk, well, vitalism is a little bit different, but if we talk about animism such that the world is comprised of subjects with perspectives, so it's a perspectival, perspectivist philosophy, and obviously that articulates very nice with everyone from like nicely from Leibniz to Uexküll's kind of mashup of Kant and Leibniz with the Umwelt and obviously the phenomenological life world and Whitehead's scheme, et cetera, et cetera. Like there are a lot of different ways of approaching that, and this is the reason why I reject panpsychism as a kind of particular definitive label, because it's been associated with a particular perspective. There are a lot of different perspectives which can equally, or better, in my opinion, and in your opinion, I know, address this issue, but from the standpoint of a kind of speculative metaphysics that won't necessarily be amenable to a kind of verificationist approach within science, but that, to be frank, we're part of where we're still going with this, I think, is that the free energy principle is a kind of suggestive principle in this sense. Like if that really were a essentially generic principle, like a principle of least action that applies to systems of all kinds in all domains that the different special sciences investigate, well, what would that suggest about the associated ontology? Not that it dictates that; it doesn't dictate that at all. It's not that kind of thing, but it still has a tacit ontology that can be
Yeah.
uncovered.
I've kind of jokingly proposed that I feel like the free energy principle emphasizes what's necessary but not sufficient for a truly creative evolutionary process. And we would also need something like, and this is sort of hearkening to William Blake's comment, energy is eternal delight. We need a principle of eternal delight alongside the principle of free energy that would show um, that there is you know, an aim beyond just survival in the biological realm. That there's also, as Whitehead would put it, there's a threefold urge in living organisms to live well, and to live better. And so there's this principle um, of eros in Whitehead's terms, that is leading that he thinks is necessary to explain why we would see in biological evolution the emergence of more complex animals that are comparatively deficient in survival value. Like if
Yeah.
survival is the thing, then why not stay bacteria? Um,
But it's very problematic to put things that way, because even if we were being Spencerian as opposed to Darwinian and saying survival of the fittest, it's not
mhm.
survival of the individual organism, it's survival of the lineage. And there are lots of ways. I'm not refuting what's being said there, but there are lots of ways of accounting for the evolution of complexity that don't require precisely that. But what I would say is really fundamental. Is that there must be a generative principle, let's say, at all levels of description. So at all levels of description, there must be something which is uncanalized,
Yeah.
essentially, and is throwing out variation. And then there are constraint functions that work on that. And the FEP is a really nice formal description of the constraint function. It has a place, as we've said, like within any Langevin equation, there is a dissipative or Brownian term, which is that represents the uncanalized variation that exists at that level of description. But
Principle of ludic freedom, maybe we could
yeah,
say. But I think I'm is that I think the theorist Huizinga
uh,
may have used that term. I don't think I just coined that. I think I'm borrowing that from someone. But yeah, this
or
freedom.
animacy first,
Mhm.
and then you're back in this animist sort of space. It moves fundamentally, whatever we can say about the nature of like whatever is fundamentally, it moves, it's differential. So most of the processy philosophers get this thing in some way.
Yeah, it's the swerve or the Kleinman even in the Greek atomists,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is already I'll do a Chalmers move and call it proto-agential.
You could say that for sure, pan proto-agential, because it's everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you could say something like that. I also think that the Pavese-Wayne paper does start to get at, and so does the Anderson-Vervaeke paper. So it's there in the literature. I don't think it's quite right the way they say it, but the affective dimension of what's going on here, like how it feels when there is a shift in precision weighting, or a balance of precision weighting between the top down and the bottom up.
Mm.
I tend to think that in situations where, again, given some, context specific degrees of freedom in the sense that we're not actually under any real survival threat, but where we can decrease the precision weighting on top-down prediction as much as possible, and essentially maximize the precision weighting of the uncanalized generative. It could be afferent, it's not necessarily afferent like we were talking about with active imagination and things, but where we can allow this free play, this generative, whatever level it's coming from, in the relevant situation, where prediction error, then the precision weighting is highest on prediction error, which means our model, to the extent that there is a model anymore, is being updated at the most rapid rate possible. That's when more, if we're talking about afferents, more of the outside is getting in. You're open monitoring, and you are all of this information, all of this, what was previously noise and what was irrelevant and being screened out, the way you've practiced to modulate your attention has modulated relevance, has modulated this relationship between signal and noise, and suddenly all of this noise is becoming signal, and you're learning about your embedding environment at this incredibly elevated rate, and it feels really good. And that's one of the problems also with the schizotypy, autism spectrum that they discuss in that paper. But it's not also to say, because there's a kind of naive, almost sort of atavistic way of thinking about this, that, well, other organisms that aren't so constrained by, the symbolic order and blah, 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 and they don't have egos and all of that, they're constantly in that blissful state. But it's precisely the transition into that state, I think, which is highly rewarding for us. And I think that there are, though, very basic biological reasons probably for that. Like, it's good for you to be aware of what's going on around you, because not being aware of what's going on around you could be really, really dangerous. So
Mhm.
embedding yourself in your environment, which is again increasing precision weighting on error propagation, such that your model is being updated more, in a more global way, means that you are more aptly, you're improving your grip, you're more aptly acquiring the sufficient statistics of your environment. Basically, you can give a free energy principle account of this, and it does feel good. And I mean, there is a way of, yes, as I kind of gestured towards, of framing that in terms of survival, but it's not like, in many cases, it's not proximally, certainly, about survival at all. It's just about, I actually really enjoy that kind of experience. I really like listening to music, like listening to music where I'm really fully attentive, and I get a buzz from the way that attention transforms reality. And again, I do think the free energy principle gives us a kind of account of that, but it's not. Again, it's not, all the generation is not going on here. It's a cessation of the constraint function, or a letting go of grasping, all of that, and emptying, all of these things which have been so widely described in so many different traditions, such that I can perceive more of what's going on. And yeah, that feels good, and I'm driven to do that. We should do the function of reason at some point, by the way, because I think it's important to engage with I mean, obviously, Whitehead's arguments are always important to engage with, but I do think there are a couple of things that he gets wrong there, because I don't actually think, like, even strictly Darwinian, classic Darwinian evolution is not about the survival of the individual. That's a mistake. Survival and fitness are not the same thing. And that's kind of important. Not
I don't know that the survival of the lineage. I don't think he's emphasizing survival of the individual necessarily. Maybe misspoke in a way that made it seem like that's what he was referring to. Um, it doesn't need to. It could be survival of the lineage. I think just understanding life and evolution as a process of um, this, just simply about the struggle for existence. And I mean, Darwin already has sexual selection, and so there is a role. Um, for the agency of organisms in the process, and the sense that Eros plays a role.
Yeah.
You know, I think,
Regardless of
yeah.
the confusion, then, not necessarily in Whitehead, but there is always the generative function. It can never be repressed. And at every level of canalization, you just get another version of this constraint function, and you can, of this generative function, sorry, of the uncanalized. So every time you set up a new arena, there are degrees of freedom within it, so to speak, right? Every canal is always overflowing its banks. There's always a body without organs correlative to every organic structure, etc. And when you have that, you get an account. And I mean, you can,
Yeah, I think all Whitehead's adding is that there is a tendency to be in tune, that variation, that generative function has a tendency to be in tune.
yeah,
There's a tendency towards um, both deviation from any canalization, but also convergence again at a sort of higher level of organization. Um,
that's precisely nested constraint functions,
mhm,
so there is an attunement. So what escapes the organizational economy of the individual organism will be canalized, will be selected if a new function is to emerge by its encounter with the world. So there's all this stochastic gene expression going on, and there are different gene products being put into different contexts all the time, just constitutive at really low levels. But if they happen to have a particular kind of encounter in that novel, molecular ecology context, then that can be reinforced essentially, right? So that the body, the organism, I mean, whatever, is always probing the world at all these different levels, is always palpating things, both molecularly and in more obviously macroscopic behavioral ways. And the feedback that we get from the world, that's where attunement comes in, right? So
mm,
this is like abduction, as we were talking about as well. There's a generative process in the play of musement that leads to the development or the suggestion of an hypothesis or a conjecture, and then it's the exposing of that to the world that tells you whether it's apt or not, essentially, right? And I think that, to be frank, I think that that's fully present in Darwinian thinking. It's just that people tend to confuse like Darwinism with natural selection, which is a constraint function which presupposes, and sure, Darwin didn't have himself a novel account of the generative variation function, but it's presupposed. It's always already there, that there's always something to draw upon. And I think there's a way connecting this all the way back to imagining like the preformed forms in the nous, in the divine nous, are the active, and they're always coming down and canalize, like a lot of the aberrant thought that we want to, we can blame Kant, we can blame Descartes or whatever, but a lot of it goes way back to those sorts of things, right? Where you're imagining that there is some system like the human or God or whatever, that, or the composer, that has the control over all the creativity and is going to impose this preformed thing on the passive matter, the passive performer, the passive woman. I will give the woman my seed, and like all of that kind of pretty gross way of, that was gross the way I said it just then, but that power dynamic, that archic dynamic, which is why ontological anarchy is the way to go. But it's the thing is, everything there is has its own generative autonomy at the appropriate level of description at which it exists. So nothing is being fully imposed. The
yeah,
act except through various impositions, power dynamics, etc. Not that they're not real, but the idea that there's this ontological cut between the active and the passive is a big part of the issue here. And I think that receives its very contemporary flowering in the like idea that predictive processing per se solves the hard problem, and that the brain is generating this incredibly rich model of the world. The brain doesn't need to do that. Why would it do that? Um,
yeah, yeah. And overcoming the preformationism implicit in kind of gene-centric understanding of evolution. And um, nobody knows what a body can do kept coming to mind, Spinoza's line. And also, not to open up a whole nother topic, we have to wrap this up, but just the
Right.
idea, Spinoza's sense of the conatus,
Yeah. Yeah.
the way that, bodies have this affective drive to self-preservation,
Yeah.
which I think I hadn't considered that as a way of a one philosophical translation of what FEP is suggesting, that there's a conatus that's how bodies stay bodies, through changing environments. So
Yeah.
I'll
Well,
have to explore that analogy more, but
definitely. One of my friends, or a guy that I talk to quite a bit on Twitter, is a real Spinozist, and he really thinks that the FEP and Spinoza have a lot to say to each other.
hmm,
And then it can be turned into an aesthetic principle, and the sort of Deleuzianization of Spinoza and all of that comes in there when precisely in this way that I was suggesting that part of the drive to survive, minimization of expected free energy, this path-based thing involves opening ourselves up to as much novelty in the moment, sometimes when it's appropriate to do so. Um, and that's what art is all about. Art is all about eliciting openness from the audience, and of course from the artist themselves, from the practitioner themselves. We do it to kind of get ourselves off aesthetically, like we induce flow states in ourselves, and we create this feedback between ourselves and something we're putting out into the world, and it feels good. And that can, I mean, I don't want to, I'm not saying this should be reduced to some like, I mean, sexual selection does reduce to natural selection on many accounts, right? It's a form of natural selection in the sense that the aesthetic sense of the female selecting for the beautiful male or whatever, the beauty of the male, and it does often go that way. Obviously, classic examples in birds and things, means that the offspring, like she selects the most beautiful male, and the offspring will then be beautiful, which means they will attract more female. There's a fitness-based account of, and that's actually the account that Darwin gives, right? Of but Darwin is trying to get aesthetics into the natural world, and but we shouldn't reduce it to that, because that's just a way of quantifying some of these things and explaining them in a particular domain. Whereas in our lived experience, we have no need of explaining it in that way. We just dig things that are beautiful.
yeah.
Um, these don't
And
need to
let's
be
let's not
quantified.
background the agency of women, I mean, and the agency of organisms
Yeah,
in
yeah.
general, in the sense that the emphasis on natural selection through, the environment saying no to particular phenotypes, um, and not really acknowledging the role that the intelligent agency and decisions of organisms makes in determining, first of all, what the environment is because they're shaping it, and also,
That it's comprised of other agents.
and
Um,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and also very important basic evolutionary point that's often missed is that it's actually members of one's own species that one is also sort of competing with in this. So it's different models of how to be this kind of thing. So different agencies amongst very similar critters are outbreeding each other in that sense. Like if you reduced all of life to something like that, it would be really unpleasant. But having that, it is unpleasant. But you don't have to be a reductionist. You can say that's actually a good explanatory principle and it accounts for a lot of stuff. But over here, I have my lived experience and the fact that I really enjoy guitar and I really love going out into the bush and finding snakes or whatever. And one can shift between these levels. I don't feel any threat from some explanatory theory to my phenomenology, basically, to my lived experience, even though there's a level of description of why I have that kind of lived experience, which could be framed in those terms, but that doesn't.
yeah.
And
I mean, in so many ways, yeah. Like the evolutionary psychologist would want to say that you won't. I mean, some of the reductive ones that you only play music as a way of attracting women. That's all that's actually motivating you, even if at the level of your conscious sense of identity, you think you're enjoying its intrinsic nature, and really you're just trying to get laid.
And the thing is, like, it's very easy to say that of course, that's a reason why people play instruments, and often consciously. But that's very far from being the whole of it. And again, most of the time, I am not in and I'm very lucky. We're incredibly blessed, some of us, to not be in a sort of survivalist situation all the time. Whether I play well tonight or not is, yeah, I mean, it can have influences on many things, on my self-esteem more than anything, especially as I'm not a professional musician,
Yeah.
but it matters to me that I play well, you
Yeah.
know. But
This is the deeper point in Whitehead's rendering of this, and maybe there are, technical issues that I'd love to dig into when we read Function of Nature, but it's the extent to which life is driven by this aesthetic drive. or life has an aesthetic drive, that it's less or not only about survival, that there's also this um, drive to intensify experience, and so um, this is why longevity and like arriving at the most um, durable form of existence isn't actually what's sometimes we flatten out the picture of natural selection, that it's like we you want to have the most, you know, in a military sense, like the toughest organism.
Well,
And
in an economic sense, because it is,
yeah,
and it is directly the way Darwin makes evolutionary biology quantifiable is by importing, Malthusian scarcity, dynamics into it. And that's a big theoretical move, but it does have these potentially unpleasant consequences. And I think, with Whitehead, and we've talked about this a lot of times, but it's partly to do with the handling of the eternal objects for me as well, and we won't get into that. But we are in fact always Heidegger, Pache Heidegger, thrown, right? We're in this context, which was constructed in a certain way, but over some like 14 billion year history or whatever. And for the likes of you and me, with roofs over our heads and all kinds of like, books that we're reading and all kinds of nonsense that we're pursuing in these philosophical conversations, it's very easy there to say that as part of our lived experience, the aesthetic drive is very primary and all of that. And I'm not saying that it's not part of the drive in all sorts of other organisms as well, but it is it's one must be nuanced in generalizing from our experience to these other experiences, and just recognizing that it doesn't mean that the the female fairy wren doesn't find the male fairy wren with his superb fairy wren with his electric blue head to be beautiful in an aesthetic way. Of course she does, and it's like it's amazing, but that doesn't at the same time mean that electric blue head and unblemished is not like can't be explained by Zahavi's or not explained away. The beauty is not explained away, but it can be accounted for in a particular frame of reference by, say, Zahavi's handicap principle. You need to be a good forager. You need to not be infested with parasites. You need to be all of these other things in order to produce, in order to generate, and we know it's like testosterone mediated color change that a lot of these birds go through, in order to generate the testosterone. The testosterone itself weakens your immune system. So you better be strong enough to handle that weakening of the immune system in order to produce the bright male phenotype, which is testosterone mediated, blah blah blah. Like again, there are different levels of description appropriate to these things. Just because Zahavi comes in and tells you that there's a handicap principle doesn't mean that the female fairy wren or the male fairy wren, even looking at a whatever, doesn't have a genuine, whatever that means, authentic, thanks Heidegger,
yeah.
that's a problem. But aesthetic experience in the
Yeah,
encounter.
and we're coordinating here. We're trying to find the right balance between efficient and final causation, I would say. And we could talk in efficient causal terms about how this occurred, and in final causal terms about why it's occurring. And those don't
Yeah,
need to be in conflict or competing causal explanations. They're just part of how we triangulate what's going on when we ask questions about the reasons for the existence of different types of beings.
yeah, absolutely. And I guess it becomes important to me, and maybe that's just part of my priors and my conditioning. Whenever we talk about finalism, I'm very, very open to finalism. I mean, I'm not open to it. I'm convinced of finalism in biology, right? And I mean, I'd be giving talks of this kind for you, and I've had many evolutionary biologists, colleagues query me because I intentionally talk about purpose and telos and all of these things slightly to annoy people in certain contexts, but also because I think it's absolutely genuine and you cannot explain like the explanatory grip of the theory will peter out at a certain level if you don't have agency. You can't do it without some kind of ontological notion of agency or purpose. And what is agency, but purpose.
Survival instinct. I mean, yeah.
Yeah. But I am also resistant to language which makes finalisms, as you know, global. I'm very resistant to wholes that are, I'm not resistant to wholes at certain levels of description, right? But I'm resistant to the notion of closed systems and any kind of global telos, because a global telos is just the inverse of a preformationist scheme. It's just it's basically the same structure of thought, just flipped, and they go together, right? So I'm very wary of teleocracy in Rainer Sherman's terms. I am an ontological anarchist if I'm anything, but
Yeah.
there are lots of reasons for that. But yeah, of course, there's all kinds of like local teloi, and they do add up to. There is a direction to things that are happening, and that's also grounded in basic physics. Um, so yeah,
Yeah.
I always kind of balk a little bit at terms like global aim and things like that, just because they
Yeah.
are,
This
yeah,
isn't telos as in pre-planned.
yeah,
It's emergent and
it's
it's
going somewhere for sure.
distributed and it's radically democratized and it's many, many aims, not any one single global aim. We don't have I don't have the bandwidth right now to get into how Whitehead's primordial nature of God figures into this, but I think I would want to massage it so that it's not doing what you're worried it might be
And
doing.
no, I know, and we've been there many times, and I think there's a productive tension there, and there's something that I refuse to allow Whitehead, and I think it's in if we're looking at his language,
Mhm.
it's less preformationist than his logic. And I maybe if it's a bit of a way of putting it, but maybe there's something that he imports from the kind of mathematics he was doing, that the kind of mathematics he's developing in developing his speculative metaphysics, which makes it a little bit more preformationist than it might need to be. Maybe. I mean, and I want to maintain that tension with his thought anyway. Like I have a vested interest in doing that because of my own, panarchical need to derive my own way of thinking about these sorts of things and not be swallowed by these incredible system builders. I mean, he's got, and more than a Deleuze and things in this sense, as a systematic philosopher, systematic process relational philosopher. I mean, it's magisterial what he's done, right? But I necessarily, therefore, also have to resist it precisely
Yeah.
because of its, you know, relative completion. His
He
his
warned us about the fallacy of the perfect dictionary, and we
exactly.
wouldn't want to treat process and reality as such.
No, yeah, he's beautiful on those sorts of things. In the language, he warns us not to take the scheme as a complete whole for sure. And then,
Let's do function of reason next.
let's
Does
do it.
that
Do you want to do
sound
it, Nick? Um, Yeah, I think there's a few places we could go. I can do one more session probably before I'm off to India for the first 2 weeks of November for a community snakebite project there.
okay?
I'm just looking at function of reason. It's on the floor down there. We could do function of reason. Maybe we do half of it. Um, we could do. I want to take us. Maybe this is for a bit later. I want us to get into some animist territory, like some
Mm,
comparative anthropology stuff, because I
okay,
think
that'd be fun.
that might be important. And then obviously there are these papers that you had mentioned, the Chandaria ones, which we'll look at. But yeah, let's do function of reason next. Let's do the first half at least. Um,
Yeah, I mean, there's this other stuff on intuitive physics as probabilistic inference. Um,
oh yeah, that you sent me that too. That looked really interesting. Look, there's never going to be a shortage of things, but it's about what's manageable um, for both the reading and it's kind of like what can we do justice to. And this has been a great conversation. We haven't done any justice to the papers that we read, but they're a springboard. And I think on the writing side of things, assuming we get to that, they are very useful for that relevance realization paper the paper we started on the basis of the naturalizing relevance realization paper. And I think maybe the Chandaria ones and maybe the intuitive physics one will also be useful to that. But it's a broad exploration. I'm happy to do some Whitehead. I'm happy to do function of reason for sure.
cool.
So yeah, we can do one I think next week, and then I'll be away for a bit, and then yeah, we
I'm
can
on
go.
retreat next week, so I can't do next Thursday. But is the final Thursday? What about the 31st? Are you
Oh, I'm around then. We're off on the third. Yeah, so that'll probably work. Yeah,
um sorry, it actually doesn't work for me. There's a conference that weekend that starts on that Thursday.
that
So we could
early.
do earlier that week, like
Yeah, that's clear.
Wednesday. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, let's
Your
do it earlier that week. Let's lock it in. We'll discuss it. But earlier that week should work. Yeah.
sure, your Thursday, my
Yeah. That's
Wednesday.
cool.
All right, Tim. That was a
So, man.
marathon. Enjoyed it. Hope you can get some
That's,
sleep this
yeah.
evening and that
Yeah.
your daughter feels better.
Yeah. Hopefully. Thanks, man.
All right. See you next time.
Yeah.